Not again, not again, not again.
Hello and welcome to the Exploding Appendix podcast. My name is Bradley Tuck, and in this session we'll be joined by Richard Barbrook to discuss Up the Republic, which was recorded as part of a Bastille Day special on the 14th of July 2020. On the 14th of July 1987, revolution was taking over Paris. An economic crisis and shortage of bread, in part occasioned by France's involvement in the American Revolution, had ignited a revolutionary republican fever that had overtaken the capital. In the mid-morning of July 14th, a group gathered outside the Bastille, a medieval fortress, a prison, and also a symbol of monarchic rule. Demanding the release of its prisoners, the removal of its canons, and the release of its arms and gunpowder, the crowd stormed the Bastille and seized control. The events of the Bastille marked a key victory in the French Revolution, but also an important date in the history of republicanism. In this session, we are joined by Richard Barbrook to discuss the events of the 14th of July and the history of revolutionary republicanism in France and elsewhere. Richard Barbrook is a senior lecturer at the University of Westminster. He is the co-author of The Californian Ideology, which he wrote in 1995 with Andy Cameron. He is also the author of Media Freedom, 1995, Imaginary Futures, From Machine Thinking to the Global Village, 2007, Class War Games, Ludic Subversion Against Spectacular Capitalism, 2014. He coordinated the Digital Democracy Manifesto for Jeremy Corbyn's 2016 leadership campaign. He is currently working on a book on the state. So this session was recorded as part of the Exploding Appendix Avant-Garde Art Practice and Research Group's fortnightly meetup, which runs via Zoom. If you would like to join, please send us a message at explodingappendix@gmail.com or check out our website at www.explodingappendix.com. Special thanks to Neil Philip Whitehead for editing this podcast. So that's all I think I have to sort of say for now. I think now over to Richard.
I think that you have to understand it's the French National Day and they celebrate a revolution every year. Lots of countries celebrate it. I mean, Zara's here from America. And I've been in America, they celebrate 4th of July when they kicked out the Brits. It's actually, most countries have a moment where they say, well, we were an old country, or the country was formed, and now we've become modern. And it's that turning point. And what's interesting, of course, in England, we don't do that. Even though we had the first real political revolution, we don't do that because the Republic was replaced in 1660 with a monarchy. So I think there's one thing, France is a large, major player in the European Union. It was a global empire in the 19th century and it had a huge influence. So that's one of the reasons why it's important, both for the French and I think globally. I mean, it's all, it's the famous story of when they asked Zhou Enlai about what he thought of the French Revolution, and he said it was too early to tell because of influence on the Chinese Revolution. So it's had that influence across the world of what do we mean by a revolution. It was predated by, the Dutch Revolt, the English Revolution, 1641 and 1688 English Revolution, 1776 American Revolution. But really, when people think about revolutions, they think about the French Revolution. As you said, the storming of the Bastille, the terror, Bonaparte, all the rest of it, and the fact that it became a republic, a democracy, it had a declaration of the rights of man and citizen. And so really we judge that. In the 20th century, in the Russian Revolution, they consciously saw that they were rerunning the French Revolution. If you watch Eisenstein's October, it's a complete fantasy about what happened in Petrograd in 1917, because they need to make the taking of the Winter Palace look like the storming of the Bastille. It has to look like a popular uprising. And so, that's a classic example where the movie becomes more real than the real. I think that's probably why it's as I said, the two things I would just say is it's very important for the French. If you go there, not this year, but I've been, in small French towns on Cateau Juliette, and the whole town comes out, everyone celebrates, they open the fire station and they have their DJs and they have a market stalls outside and bands playing and everyone gets drunk and stoned and lots of good food being French. And it's a great, and even of course now after post-Second World War, even the priest turns up. Times I've been in France and Bastille, it's been great. And it's a great time of the year. If you want to have a public celebration, the good things about your nation, have it in July when the weather's excellent.
There's usually fireworks later.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're very good. Yeah, I forgot that. There's always excellent fireworks.
So for thinkers like people like Hannah Arendt, the American Revolution is a kind of positive revolution, whereas the French Revolution is not. So the Jacobin descent into terror sort of becomes almost morally indefensible. How should we think about the sort of violence of the French Revolution?
Yeah, it's a classic counter between the American Liberal Revolution, where they basically have a political revolution. Essentially the same people who are in charge of colonial America charge at the end, the Virginia slave owners. Whereas the French Revolution, it's a social revolution, as you say. I think it's interesting that they focus on violence, because if you think about the American Revolution, first it was violent. It was an armed revolution. They defeated the British by force of arms. And of course, the violence of something like slavery or the dispossession of the indigenous population is overlooked in that. I think, the shocking thing about the French Revolution at the time was not the fact that they executed large numbers of people. They were executing large numbers of people in England for property crimes. Mm-hmm. It's the class origins of the people who they were executing. The king, the aristocracy, bishop. So that's partly there are in the Civil War, both sides commit terrible massacres. But that's not really what it's about. If you read the sort of 19th century history, it's the social standing of the victim that's shocking. You're allowed to hang poor people for theft, but what you're not allowed to do is hang rich people for oppressing the peasants and the artisans. But obviously after 1917, the counterpose is really between the Russian Revolution. So the French Revolution, as I said, the Russian Revolution, they saw themselves as rerunning the French Revolution. But also in history and politics, the French Revolution is seen as the forerunner of the Russian Revolution. So in the Cold War, if you attack the French Revolution, it's a way of attacking the Soviet Union. Francois Furet, who becomes this the doyen of revisionist historians in sort of 1970s onwards in France, he was a Stalinist in the 50s. So as they recant their dodgy politics of supporting totalitarianism in the East, they go to the other stage and start to apologise for, American imperialism instead, and attacking the French Revolution as a way of doing it. I mean, he says, at the beginning it was all going to be like a liberal constitutional revolution, like the 1688 in England or 1776 in America, and then he said it slips out of control. Basically, the mob take over, crazy Freemasons and they basically go crazy. What I think, it's a very dubious reading of the French Revolution, because it ignores the fact that they were attacked by all their neighbouring states. It ignores that they really were people plotting to try and bring back the king, and they had a right to be afraid of the back. I mean, in 1572, in the St. Bartholomew's Massacre, which was, etched into every Parisian's mind, the Catholic Church had massacred thousands of Protestants, and that's what they were afraid of. It was either you kill them or they'll kill you. And that doesn't lead to very democratic politics. It was the Great Fear, it was called at the time. The aristocrats would come back and kill everybody who disagreed with them. And of course, in France, it did happen later on. In 1848, they used the military to suppress the workers of Paris. And then, of course, worst of all, in 1871 with the Paris Commune. And then again, you can see in 1940 to 1944 with the Vichy regime. So there had been times when the French right had been incredibly brutal to get its way. What's shocking is what the left did it, and for a moment they won. I think also that's partly the reason why people don't like it. It's a period where you could say, well, the left actually did achieve something. Georges Clemenceau is this sort of famous late 19th century, early 20th century French Republican, and he said there was some debate about the French Revolution in the Assemblée Nationale, and he goes, the revolution is a block. If you like the good things about it, which people celebrate today, the democratic republic, the rights of man and citizen, you've also got to accept the bad bits, the terror, Bonaparte, because they really go together. You can't really disentangle one from the other. And the way you got that was through methods that people today would deplore and would hope that you could avoid. I was at Westminster a long time ago. Alain Touraine came for an event there, And we had this whole discussion, and he was saying the same thing, all about how, the American Revolution is good, the French Revolution is bad. And I said to him, well, 100 years after the French Revolution, everything the Jacobins wanted was true. They had the tricolour was the flag, the Marseillaise was the national anthem, the 14 Juillet, Bastille Day is the annual holiday, Marianne is in every town hall, and so that everything they wanted, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and so everything they achieved, it took 100 years, but they got there. And he just flipped out and started shouting at me and accusing me of being a totalitarian, which I thought was hilarious. If you concentrate on the horrors of the French Revolution, you miss its long-term achievement, which is worth celebrating.
So do you think it gets the French Revolution gets a sort of bad rep because it sort of like the bourgeoisie were attacked in it or something like that? You think like the bourgeois press now represent it as more violent than other violent events? Is there any
English revolution? Nearly 5% of the population died. So I think all revolutions tend to be violent. Most, actually, it's interesting. The Irish Revolution is one of the which people go on about IRA violence. Actually, if you look at it, by the proportion of population, very few people died, actually. The English managed to kill large numbers of people up to the Irish Revolution through famine and oppression. But the actual revolution itself in the 1920s, I think the civil wars were bloodthirsty. So again, I think the formation of these nation states is often very violent because you're overthrowing an old order. And it is a bourgeois revolution. Yes, the artisans and the peasants made it possible. But at the end of the day, they set up, a system that allowed French capitalism and became a great European empire. I mean, they went around and conquered large chunks of Africa and Southeast Asia. It's a very ambiguous achievement. Before we started, I was talking to Bradley that I remember being there in the 1980s, and I had my English partner, she was living in Paris. And I suggested to the French friends that we should all go and see the Bastille Parade. Having been a teenage war game, I was to go and see the tanks and the cavalry, and they were absolutely horrified. They just thought I was a crazy English leftist. But I was saying, I said, well, you're a French, it's a republic, you can celebrate these things. Okay, there's this other side to it, obviously, but on the other hand, you should celebrate. It's not just those parties in the fire station. There is something about, it's a republic. The army goes and says, look, you are the president, here's the politicians, and you're the civilians, and we'll serve you. And that was a great achievement. We don't serve the aristocracy. We don't serve the king. We serve the elected representatives of the people. And you can disagree with lots of stuff about the French Republic. That was an important historical achievement. In England, the army swears allegiance to the Queen, not to the people. That, I think, is a strange hangover of an earlier and worse time.
Well, I was wanting to ask you a little bit about the English Revolution, because I feel like with the American and the French Revolution, we think about it. They seem important historically, but we often tend to forget the sort of English Revolution. It almost seems to be sort of...
Well, it's the same problem, as I said, I think, with the French Revolution or any revolution, is that once they win, is people become embarrassed by them. The people who gain from the revolution often then feel... There's two ways of dealing with it. One is to celebrate it every year, and that's a way of putting it to bed. You have like a formal celebration. One of the reasons the French, the elite, celebrate the revolution on the 14th of July is because they don't want another revolution. Mm-hmm. And they've had one within living memory in May 68. So they do know that it's possible. And the other is to sort of romanticise the defeated side. I mean, Zara's here from America, and the key thing after the Civil War, which was the second revolution, was that the whole lost cause myth. So once they defeated the slaveocracy, they started romanticising about, the plantations and all the Confederate cause being somehow doomed but romantic. And the same happened in England. You get this whole thing about once the bourgeoisie had won its revolution, the Whigs were firmly in power. And particularly in the 19th century, they started romanticising the Cavaliers because they were not a threat anymore. Once you weren't going to have an absolutist monarchy and you weren't going to bring back some form of Catholic church, terrorise the population, then they could romanticise. It all became Gothic, or, it became doomed and romantic. A bit like the Jacobites in Scotland. I mean, that was a sort of hangover. And that's the other side of it. And so the problem with the English Revolution, the English bourgeoisie didn't need it anymore. And particularly, they could the 1688 English Revolution, they could, because they became a constitutional monarchy. I mean, they basically instituted a republic, but they kept the monarchy as a sort of decoration. They couldn't really do anything against the ruling elite who controlled the Houses of Parliament. But the 1641 revolution is much more embarrassing, because that's where they tried the king, cut his head off in public, formed a republic. You have all these things like levellers and diggers and ranters. And that's really, it's always been there. It's interesting. I've been doing some research on English republicanism, and it's interesting because in the 18th century, people knew about it. And in the 19th century, in the 20th century. So there's always been a sort of left field appreciation of our Great Revolution. It's never been officially recognised. And that's it. We don't celebrate the English Revolution every year. In school, we're taught it as the English Civil War. There's very few films about it. I mean, there's a few things. There was that TV series, The Devil's Hall. There's a rather romanticised view of Cromwell film ago. There's a great Stanley film, which is fabulous. Don't have an agrarian communist revolution in the country where it rains all the time. That sort of thing. But it's remarkable how few, and even the films there are out there, a lot of them are pro-Cavalier, because, again, they're safe. Again, they see the revolution as basically they're Stalinists or, Bolsheviks of some kind who are a threat. They're crazy fanatics, essentially. Again, without the crazy fanatics, we wouldn't be there. It's the radical Protestants, because the radical Protestants have all read Exodus, where, God has a covenant with the Jews, and they go, well, that's what we want. We want a covenant. They're the agreement of the people. It becomes the social contract. And that, the citizens form the same. The most basic ideas of democracy come from the English Revolution, which is, doesn't come from above. It's not God, it's not the king, it's not the bishops and the aristocracy. It's the people who form an agreement between themselves. Okay, it's only men, but in the English Revolution, it was men without property, which is really radical for the 17th century. And they formed the social contracts, and they said in the agreement of people that the rights of men come first, that the purpose of the republic is to defend the rights of man, not the other way around. It's not like in America where you form the state and then you add the amendments. They did it the other way around. You can see. So it's interesting that I've seen Tony Benn talk about and Edward Thompson. So it's always been there on the English left, and the Chartists in the 19th century and the Republicans in the 18th century. They all knew about it and they've talked about it, and people publish books about it. But it's never been a central part of our lives. We don't have a Bastille Day, and I think that's a really bad thing. And if you look at the last two Labour manifestos, it's really interesting. They talk about having a constitutional convention, but they don't talk about having a republic. We would never talk about that. That's quite the most radical leadership we've had in my lifetime. Whereas republicanism, it should be a basic. We should be against the monarchy in principle, regardless of what we think about the Queen. The idea of having a hereditary head of state is somewhat disgusting, I think. We're not cattle to be inherited.
Is that all about retaining the monarchy, do you think? There's an element of that defending the monarchy.
They're a bourgeois monarchy, aren't they? So, people it's the whole dressing up, and it's what Walter Baggot taught, the difference between the dignified and the effective part of the Constitution. I mean, if you go to the Houses of Parliament, I've been to, there's a thing called the Royal Robing Room, which is the most bling over the top place, because it has no power. And then you go to the House of Lords, which has much less power. You have hardly any power now. And that's a fabulous piece of late Victorian Gothic, sort of Disneyland, but imperial. They've got money, serious money spent on that. Britain was then a world empire. And then you go to the Commons, and it's the most, sober part. But that's where the power is. So the inversion between the two. And that's what Baggot says. The masses cheer the monarchy, and that distracts them from where power's really been held. And certainly they learned that in the 17th century, that that's why they kicked out James II for being a Catholic despot and brought in Dutch Billy, because he was pliable and they could just pay him and he'd do what he wanted. The Whigs' famous favourite king was George I and George II. George I, they actually couldn't speak English. They just paid them money. George II actually would formally command the troops on the battlefield. So they had someone to cheer. But all the power was in the hands of the House of Commons, Robert Walpole, or the Whig oligarch. I mean, the only trouble came when George III spoke English and he started to screw up. That's how we lost the American colony. But having a monarch who can't speak your language is perfect because they just do the show.
The state that the British Constitution has just always been like that.
Yeah,
Whereas
I think
French, by celebrating it, changed.
You look at the BBC history programmes. If you go on iPlayer and you look at it, almost, it's amazing the amount of monarchy stuff on there. It's either very trivial, sort of what was housing like in the past, but there's very little on the social struggles that created modern country. It gives us a false idea of continuity, that the crowd, there's a gradual evolution from monarchy into modern Britain, and that's partly what the advantage of it is. I think it gives this false idea of stability, and the fact that we had this violent revolution where I said nearly 1 in 20 of the population died, and probably even more in Ireland. And Scotland was also very light. That just goes against that. So even by the late 18th century, Edmund Burke could say, the French are having this bloodthirsty revolution, and we just had this peaceful change of power in the Glorious Revolution, completely ignoring the 1641 English Revolution, which is actually far more important. That's why James II ran away at the crucial moment, because he knew if he didn't run away, he was likely to be put on trial and have his head removed, like that happened to his father. So I think that's an interesting part of it, is that once the revolution is victorious, you can forget about it. You think, say in France, because it became a contested thing between the right and the left. And in a way, it's interesting, in France, all the national symbols are actually party symbols. They're the Jacobin party symbols. Of course, most people wouldn't even think about that now. The French right all sing the Marseillaise. I think it's really funny because when it says, it says impure blood watering the furrows, it's their blood they're singing about. But they don't even think about it. It's just become part of the fabric of life. But whereas the monarchy and the British flag hasn't really become part of that. I mean, I remember Tony Blair in the sort of height of New Labour was trying to get the Labour Party to wave the Union Jack. And even then, it was very difficult, because people on the left feel very uncomfortable about the Union Jack. Partly if you're, lots of English people, particularly on the left, have Irish descent or, other ex-imperial colonies. So we feel very dodgy about the Union Jack. And also the whole monarchy side of it. It makes it very difficult if you even nominally, not even very left-wing left, or soft left, to actually embrace those national symbols. I mean, I used to work with refugees, and I used to feel slightly jealous that they could wrap themselves in the national flag without any embarrassment, because there's always something good in their national flag. Bad bits in it, but so in France, who has the best national anthem in the world, the international socialist movement has the Internationale, so at least that's probably a better song. But so you've got those sorts of symbols. So I think it's difficult for the English to do that. But if you went and looked at the French Revolution, they would have seen themselves as the heirs to the English Revolution. First 1688, and then as it got more radical, 1641. And they knew about the left. They knew about Cromwell. So, when Bonaparte seizes power, they say, it's Cromwell. It's only afterwards, once the French Revolution becomes the archetypical revolution, that then, the French forget about the fact that they were copying the English.
In terms of copying revolutions, what do you see the link? Because I've read a few bits and pieces which have suggested that a lot of the French were imagining, especially in the Paris Commune, that they were creating a new Rome and the relationship to the Roman Empire.
Roman Republic.
Yeah.
And Greek. I mean, they all had the intellectuals had a classical education, a Renaissance education. So, they knew about that. Or they read Machiavelli, of course. That's the other thing people forget about there, is Machiavelli wrote this famous book called The Discourses on Livy, the first 10 books of Livy's history of Rome. And so that was the other great text that they all saw it through. The first Republican experiment in that, the Dutch Republic to a certain extent, but is really the English Republic. The texts of it were published, they were translated into French, and they circulated around. So, the American revolutionaries read about it. That's why you go to America and they have universities named after Algernon Sidney and John Hampden and all these characters from the English Revolution. They're better known in some ways in America and commemorating than they are here in England. It's really weird. If we have a huge constitutional crisis, as is looking at the United Kingdom falls to pieces, we have another republic, we'll start putting up statues. Henry Martin, that's one I suggest we put one up. He was a Bohemian Republican. He voted for the king's execution and still manages to survive the Restoration, which I think is quite admirable. In England, the monarchy was restored in 1660, and then when they had the Second Revolution, we didn't go back to being a republic. They just got found the husband of a Stuart. But obviously, it completely changed because at that point it meant that the Parliament picked the king, and that was the key thing. That was so it's very difficult to celebrate a republican revolution if you've decided for social stability you want to keep the monarch. In the 18th century, they said England is a crowned republic because we think of republics as something without a basic definition. It would be a state without a monarchy. But in the 18th century, they wouldn't have thought that. They would have said you can have a monarchy and be a republic, because where power is not in the hands of the king. Okay, the king has some power, but at the end of the day in England, the power is in the hands of the Whig oligarchy. If the king misbehaves, they get rid of them. And in America, that's what happened. In America, in a sense, they got pissed off with what was going on in London. They replaced it with a formal republic. But it was the same people essentially in control. The real power lay in America in the late 18th century with the merchants in the north and the slave owners in the south. The English monarchy and the Tory oligarchs who supported him they disagreed with him. They could kick them out, essentially, which is what they did do.
I'm wondering if really the real question isn't why we don't celebrate the English Revolution more, and more why, bearing in mind his revolution was defeated within a generation of him dying, he was dug up, posthumously executed, the restoration of the monarchy, why Oliver Cromwell is a celebrated figure rather than not just seen as a usurper and a traitor. You get statues of Oliver Cromwell.
Irish people always think it's very weird that we have an Oliver Cromwell statue outside Bath, because I think he's got relatives from Wexford, which is one place which his troops stormed and massacred the population because they didn't surrender. And his relatives say, what's he doing outside there? It wasn't defeated. I think that's the point. The Republic was defeated, but not the Whig oligarchy. They were terrified of it becoming a leveller republic. In 1688, they did win. So the people who, again, it's a bit like the French Revolution. At the beginning of the revolution, what they wanted was the king to obey Parliament. But Charles I was a crazy man. I mean, he basically caused the war. He started the war because he wouldn't share power with the oligarchy. And they then won the war. But in doing so, they had to create the new model army and mobilise the population, and then they went too far. So Cromwell is partly celebrated because he restored order, and he is like the first prime minister. He's the MP who takes the power of the king. But after the 1688 revolution, very soon you get the emergence of the prime minister, Robert Walpole being the famous one, where all real power is in the hands of the person who controls the majority in the Houses of Parliament. And so the only place that celebrates the 1688 revolution, of course, is the north of Ireland, because on the 12th of July, it's not celebrating a revolution, it's celebrating imperialism. So it has, again, it's interesting how we don't celebrate. It's interesting, it'd be interesting to do, I haven't really done it, but of course, in the 19th century, when there was lots of Irish immigration, in places like Liverpool and Glasgow, and even I can remember as a child going to Scotland, they had UVF written on the wall. So they had like this, loyalist fascist groups, terrorist groups. So there's still this legacy of sectarianism. You get Tory voting Protestant who would celebrate the 12th of July, the 1688 revolution, the victory over the Catholics, the Jacobites later on. I mean, that's really disappeared, I think, with the rise of Scottish nationalism.
It hasn't. I mean, you've seen pro-asylum seeker protests in Glasgow recently attacked by
but they're very small compared. They weren't
loyalist forces. But I remember when I went to, again, from growing up in a loyalist area in the outskirts of Belfast, going to Glasgow University in the late 90s, and seeing UVF graffiti in the student halls at Glasgow University. Yeah. I was used to seeing it at home, but I didn't expect.
I think the interesting is, you think that Scotland had a Tory majority in the 1950s. Okay, I mean, it's 70 years ago now, or 60 the odd year.
Yeah.
And then it went Labour, and now it's got NAP. And the same with Liverpool. Liverpool was a Tory stronghold, and now it's the most left city in the north of England. It's almost impossible to be a Tory. It certainly was the most Remain city, I think. I think it's interesting. They understood that one correctly. I think that's interesting, which we haven't really talked about, the way it's about 1688 was the Victorious Revolution, and it's the way that's been forgotten, and that maybe is something to do with, you say, that it's just become associated with Ulster loyalism. And really, the English always found that embarrassing. I mean, I always remember when the war was going on, so the IRA is letting off bombs in England, and people were opening Irish theme pubs simultaneously. These are Irish Catholic, Celtic themed pubs. And sometimes they'd even have Irish Republican symbolism in them. These are capitalists. There's nothing to do with the politics. Because that's what English people want. The English people were not identifying. They weren't opening orange-themed pubs. They were green-themed pubs. They had beer. I was remembering they'd have the Irish word for men, for toilets. That was always the bit. You'd have to guess, because you're supposed to know what it is. And that was what the English wanted. They did, and I remember they did this thing about a tourist going to Dublin, English tourist, and going to Kilmainham jail, which is where they murdered the leaders of 1916. It was like number 3 after the Guinness Brewery. So again, that's a really interesting thing that, so the whole 1688 cult, which comes out of, in the 18th century, people like Edmund Burke in the 19th century with the whole loyalist, imperial, popular Toryism, that's really disappeared in a very fundamental way. So we've forgotten that revolution, the 1641, but we've also forgotten the 1688 revolution. And that, apart from the Ulster loyalists who are still marching up and down the roads, trying to intimidate their neighbours.
A friend from Colombia who visited Belfast a few years ago, knowing nothing about conflict, and she was amazed at how essentially Ulster Protestants base their identity around having been used as cannon fodder in other people's wars, but are completely irrelevant to.
They have a Dutchman as one of their main. Yeah. He's not even a Scot. Scotch Irish. He's an import.
1916 as well. The symbol of the storm and Irish heroism, despite the.
I guess that's right. Yeah, no, it's just right. It's a strange culture.
So, in your book, Class War Games, how the French Revolution changes military strategy. So the citizen soldiers approach war in a very different way than the brutalised conscripts of the absolute monarchy. To what extent has the French Revolution left its mark on military strategy?
Well, again, I think, the 1641 English Revolution is a good example. Actually, the same thing, where the way they won the war was through the new model army, to have a politicised army. Instead of just having, like in America, they had militias. The country was actually defended largely by militias and for 1641. But so you start off with both sides raising militias and getting veterans of the 30 Years' War to fight. But then, and it becomes essentially a military stalemate, and it's only broken when the Parliament sets up a politicised army. They recruit people, at least the core of the army, pay them, because they are motivated partly by radical Protestantism, but also a millenarian vision of a Protestant republic. Actually, as early as 1644, they were saying "No king but Jesus," which basically means "off with his head." So, and that's what creates, the Putney debates and the whole agreement of the people comes out of that. So, in the French Revolution, you get exactly the same thing. The way everybody expected that when the professional armies of Europe, the Prussians and the Austrians, and marched towards Paris, that they'd win. Because they were up against the rabble, the mob. But actually, they came up against people who were motivated. I mean, the Marseillaise is the song of the volunteers who march up from Marseille to Paris. And this is the song that was written for them to go and save the Republic from foreign invasion. I think this is a really interesting way. If you read the sort of military history, they always talk about it as an army of virtue, a politicised army. And it did affect the tactics, because a lot of things, like in the American Revolution, they weren't going to stand in line and get shelled. They tended to go into skirmish lines and this sort of thing. The other interesting is that if they retreated, what used to freak out the professionals is usually when someone retreated, they thought, oh, that's it. But what they used to do is rally and then go back and fight again. So they wouldn't stand necessarily and fight to accept casualties. They would retreat, but they wouldn't actually run off the battlefield. So again, it was a very self-organising army. You could decentralise a lot of the command and trust people at a local level, both strategically and the battle, to actually do things, because they weren't blindly obeying orders from above. I mean, the classic example is the difference in 1800 in Marengo. Bonaparte basically put himself in a rather strategically weak position and was about to lose the Battle of Marengo, but another part of his army that he detached, had heard the battle, and without waiting for orders, they marched and saved the day. General Desai died as a consequence. But in 1815 in Waterloo, in a similar position, this detached speech by Grattan, they heard the battle, but they didn't march to relieve Napoleon, because they knew they had to obey orders without question. So there was a difference between a republican army that would make its own decisions and the imperial army that would only accept orders from above and just follow that, because they knew if you don't follow the letter of the orders, you get sacked. And it goes forward then. So if you read, I don't know, Mao Zedong on Guerrilla Warfare, it's a lot of the same thing. How do we beat the Japanese or later the nationalists? It's because we have a politicised army and they know what to do. It's partly tactics, but it's also by the fact that both at a strategic and tactical level, they know what to do without necessarily being told what to do from above. And this gives you flexibility and allows you to win.
Isn't that the opposite of what the new model army were doing? Weren't they incredibly almost regimented in the same way that an imperial army would be? Or would they fight more?
No, the thing is, you have to understand, they were better disciplined. So if you look at something like when Marston Moore and Naseby, which are the two great parliaments, it's the fact that the royalist cavalry would beat the parliamentarian cavalry and then they'd run off and loot the baggage train and get drunk and that sort of thing, having done their job. Whereas the whole point about the parliamentarian cavalry is that once it's done the job of getting rid of the royalist cavalry, it would then turn around and attack the royalist infantry in the rear. And that's to do with self-discipline, to not get excited. That's on a purely military basis.
Was that the case with the French as well? That even though they weren't as organised, they would...
They became, what they did is they did what we call demi-brigade. So they took half the old army, professionals, and mix them with volunteers. Professionals would teach the volunteers how to fight, and the volunteers would radicalise the professionals.
Okay.
And of course, it was the defection of the army to the revolution that actually won it, like in all revolution. It's very difficult to overcome, unless you're in Chinese Civil War, I guess. But in most revolutions, the professional army either falls to pieces or it defects, like in the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks seized power because they controlled the Petrograd garrison. And in February, it was because the Cossacks, who were the classic counter-revolutionary force, in February 1917, they wouldn't cut down the demonstrators. In that sense, at the beginning of the French Revolution, a key part of the army defected to the revolution. They had that skills. In Valmy, which is the famous victory at the beginning, they had the artillery. So the artillery, which was the more bourgeois end of the army, you didn't have to be an aristocrat to command it, get an officership in. That's why Bonaparte comes from the artillery. They didn't defect, and so they actually had very good artillery as well.
That sort of decentralised organisation, did that sort of arise organically in the revolution?
I think they had no choice, because they lost a lot of the officer corps. The officer corps were aristocrats, but the navy was much more aristocratically dominated than the army. Though France had quite a good navy before the revolution, that's why the Americans won their independence, famously. Yorktown was cut off by the French navy. The navy never really recovered from the revolution. Bonaparte tried to reconstruct, but it was always outgunned by the Royal Navy.
Is it possible that Britain doesn't celebrate a revolution because there's kind of a clash between Protestant Reformation as a revolution and
we don't celebrate that either.
Celebrate that.
But we have lots of Catholic immigrants since then. Catholicism has ceased to be an upper class thing. We all hated Catholics when it was a sign of being a member of the ruling class. But when they went poor Irish people, that was sectarian. It was a different thing. We were talking about that earlier in Glasgow, Ireland, sectarianism.
How do you feel about...
It's become very difficult. I mean, you might be right. That's the whole loyalism, Ulster loyalism, Orangeism. That's partly a hangover of Protestantism turning into a right-wing phenomenon rather than left. No, in England, it's sort of what official ceremonies we have tend to be monarchical. You have like royal jubilees and people are supposed to put out tables and celebrate it. I'm the punk generation, so the great thing about the Sex Pistols was releasing this tune called God Save the Queen. because they were having a royal jubilee. And it caused an absolute sense. I mean, now it seems sort of ridiculous, but it caused an absolute sensation. He got to number 1. And they had to rig the charts to stop it being played.
And it was, yeah.
1977, I think it was. I still have my stuffed Jubilee badge somewhere. So the left had these rather po-faced demonstrations, but as old situationists, Malcolm McLaren and Vivian Westwood knew how to really subvert it. I mean, it's less so. I think it's it's an older generation thing, isn't it, in England? Because they recently were trying to get everybody to celebrate VE Day and things like that, weren't they? Which, I suppose, on the Russian model. It's, Brexit is like beating the Nazis, or an absurd thing like that. It's just interesting that we don't really have that sort of national celebration. To make it successful, it at least has to be appealed to the left. And that's difficult. If it's monarchical, it's not going to appeal to the left. Whereas you can have a Republican celebration in France, and the right, it took them 150 years, but they'll join in as well. As I said, even the priest was there. When I was in the south of France, the priest turned, which they would never have done before Vichy. After Vichy, they had to turn because they collaborated.
How do you feel about Baidu's notion of the event? Do you read any Baidu?
The old Maoist.
I mean, I guess a little bit. He's gone very far away from Mao, hasn't he?
Well, he doesn't. He claims the Cultural Revolution was the greatest revolution of the 20th century.
The stuff with the multiple isn't very Maoist. The stuff with all the
philosophy is their philosophy. I mean, actually, Mao's a much better writer. I prefer Mao to Barbruck. He might have been a rather grotesque leader in some ways of China, but he actually is a really good writer. I will say that.
Yeah, I think Mao is quite an interesting, because you can take things from Mao, because he has that sort of like radical democratic side to Mao.
Oh, well, he started off as an anarchist. And again, he's very much formed by the French Revolution as well. I mean, obviously, you've read a lot of Chinese history. He's absolutely soaked in the classics. You have to understand they come from the French Revolutionary tradition, and they see the Russian Revolution as the latest version of it, modernising revolution.
Isn't part of the irony with Mao the fact that he was this committed Marxist-Leninist whose perhaps revolutionary idealism sort of like outpaced the actual material means in China at the time to advance via some sort of dialectical historical process?
No, I think that was Chen Zizhi.
Right.
They saw an urban revolution. So Chen Zizhi, the other great founder, the 4th of May movement, 1919, and he's one of the elders. Obviously, Mao's also involved in that. He was a librarian at Beijing University at the time. But, Mao sees that really what we need is a peasant revolution, because that works in the past. That's how the Ming Dynasty came to power. Look at the Taiping Revolution in the 19th century. That's how we're going to do it. But Chen Zizhi says, no, we want to do a Western-style urban revolution. I mean, partly Petrograd 1917, but he's also looking at Paris 1789. And that failed. And, of course, Chen Zizhi is interesting because at the end of his life, he actually reads lots of Marx and goes, well, what we need first is a democratic republic. I met somebody from a city near Wuhan who teaches human rights, and they tried to set up a Chen Zizhi reading group because he came from near their city, and the local PSB came around and told them they weren't allowed to do that. They put up statues of him, and he was allowed to be in the library, but actually to seriously read his late work was considered to be too subversive.
Is that this like modern Chinese Communist Party kind of revisionism just like in action, or something?
Well, no, because it was also Chen Zizhi was thrown out the party in the early 30s when he was released from jail. He never rejoined because he rejected.
Right.
He was seen as a Trotskyist at one point, but then he rejects Bolshevism altogether. He says that's the problem, is Bolshevism. If you want to run a bourgeois revolution with red flags, Mao's correct. That the Bolshevik model is the model, the Jacobin model, actually. That they see themselves, both the Bolsheviks in Russia and later in China, as copying the Jacobin. So I don't think he did it. I think the point about Mao is he adapted. He worked out how to have a modernising revolution. It's socialism with Chinese characteristics. But the thing is, the interesting, if you talk to Chinese leftists, which I have, is that they've had so many different versions of Chinese socialism and Chinese characteristics between the 1920s and today. That's the other interesting, because in Russia it got caught with state capitalism. The state had to own everything, whereas in China they've had lots of different models, because Mao started off as a admirer of Kropotkin, so right from the beginning they started off with peasant communes as the fantasy.
Without sidetracking the conversation too much, you said you're speaking to sort of Chinese leftists, etc. I mean, it's a voice that we don't always hear. What is this particular? Is there a favoured kind of model of socialism with Chinese characteristics that is popular currently that you're aware of?
You can go to, there's a site called Chuang, which which is like they're the left communists. It's really good. I mean, I don't agree necessarily with all of it. I mean, there's obviously different, it's contrary to the West's opinion. There's actually quite a lot of intellectual debate going on. It's obviously confined within, you have to be careful how far you stray out of official, but there are, obviously there's dissident voices, and even within the official voices there's debate. It's a modernising capitalist state, the most successful in human history, of course. But I think, again, when you think about the French Revolution, I think this is why the parallel's interesting, because we've been talking about it so long. Now we think about it as the sans-culottes, the peasants, and that's what's the radicalism, the democratic republic, the rights of man and citizen, and all of that was important, and a massive redistribution of land and other property took place. And yet out of that came a modern capitalist society, different from the English and American ones, but nonetheless it was a very successful one. And it has been right up to now. It's one of the top countries in the world. It has lots of social difficulties now and economic difficulties. It's that mass mobilisation of the population is needed to break with the old order and lay the basis for the new order. It doesn't necessarily liberate people completely. But you can say, you can look at the Chinese Revolution, it's been incredibly successful.
Yeah.
People were really poor in 1949 and had an average lifespan of 35. And now they are moderately prosperous, I think the government calls it. And the average lifespan is 78. So it's more than doubled. So what are you comparing? You're comparing like with like. This is the interesting. And the same with the French Revolution. You look at the incredible violence of it, but the old regime was very violent. That's how it stayed in power. It was killing people if they rebelled or stole property. It oppressed people. It kept them. They died young because they had horrible lives in poverty. And the revolution lifted lots of people out of poverty. It took a long time to do it, but it got there eventually.
It does seem that when there are these short-term bursts of losses due to like a revolution in progress, there's this double standard, whereas in like the passive long-term deaths, I mean, famously there's this victims of communism group or something.
Well, it was funded by the CIA, the Black Book of Communism.
That's it. And they've got this running, ticking total of the amount of people which is completely arbitrary and not based in any sort of kind of objective.
Everyone would
be much larger.
Right. But there's no victims of capitalism counter, which is the big point. There's these whole ideas of every single person who's ever died in prison or died as a result of starvation or poverty.
In France, if you take the France-Chinese example, so you would look at something like the Vendée, which is always held up, because there was this incredibly brutal suppression, royalist uprising in the west of France. And yet, the brutal oppression of earlier peasant uprisings by the royalists, or the religious wars. As I said, you talk about the September massacres in 1792. A lot of it came out of the fear of the St. Bartholomew's massacre of 1572, which everyone could remember in Paris. So a lot of it is to do with the regime that they were fighting against were very, very oppressive and very, very violent, because that's how you keep the small minority in wealth and power. I think it's Peter Linenbauer in The London Hanged. I think there where he points out more people were being hanged for property crimes in London than were being guillotined during the terror. So actually, there were more executions, public executions going on in London in the early 1790s than there were in Paris. But the thing was that they were aristocrats, as I said earlier. That was the difference.
The thing that got me when I started to read up on the French Revolution and read up on the number of people who had been executed in my early 20s. What shocked me was, in relative terms, how few it was. I believe 25 to 30,000 over
the Russian Revolution or the Chinese.
Of 18 months, but not just compared to the horrific events of the 20th century, but compared to the clearing of the Paris Commune, where the same number of people were killed in 3 days as were killed in 18 months of the French Revolution.
Or what the Vichy regime did. Shipping people off to gas chambers, just the general vicious oppression of any opposition.
Rate of attrition, as is referred to. Or just, again, contemporary example to the French Revolution. Number of peasants died building St. Petersburg in 6 months, died in the French Revolution in 18 months.
Yeah, I know. Again, I think it's to do with the politicisation of history. What's shocking is the revolution. I find lots of evidence in revolutions, violence and oppression and exploitation, and that's what you highlight. You can see that, as I said, it's interesting because, we've had this whole statues controversy in America and to a lesser extent here. And then in America, as I said, the people like Ulysses S. Grant is always denounced because his son was corrupt, or on the frontier there were some wars against indigenous populations. You can always find something in his history which could be seen as politically incorrect, not woke enough. The fact that the guy beat the slave owners' army and crushed the Ku Klux Klan when he's president is completely forgotten.
Just a shame he didn't hang them all when he had a chance.
Yeah, or redistribute their land. Actually, that was the key.
Hang every one of the leaders would be my stance.
I think that in retrospect would have been good. So they'd been more ruthless. It would have been better for the American Reconstruction.
So this question is actually going to be about art. As far as I'm aware, the first usage of the term avant-garde is in relation to art is used in the 19th century Saint-Simonian text, the artist, the scientist, and the industrialist.
Henri Saint-Simon himself, actually.
But the text itself sort of imagines this union of artists, scientists, and industrialists in the image of the encyclopedists.
Yeah.
So it's clearly imagining a much broader sort of precedent for this kind of new way of thinking about art, or this way of thinking about art. And I think if we think about this in relation to the French Revolution, I realise that it's also a period of profound cultural upheaval. So whether we're thinking about the cult of reason, the sort of republican calendar, the painting of David and his festivals, a really interesting attempt to reinvent art and to use it for a revolutionary cause. So I'm sort of wondering, to what extent does the way that we see art and the way we see the art relationship between art and politics, to what extent has that been changed by these kind of preceding kind of events?
This is one thing that the French Revolution does have over the English Revolution. There really wasn't a revolutionary art movement. We had revolutionary religion. We had the wonderful Ebenezer Cope and people like that. Yeah. And we did have, as I said, hippie communes going out and digging up the commons and turning them into agriculture. So we had lots of things, but we didn't have a radical art movement, and that's a really interesting thing about because Jacques-Louis David was the star artist before the revolution. And in fact, things like the Oath of the Horatii or the lictors bringing the Brutus's sons' bodies in, these were seen as Republican propaganda before the revolution. And then they have this very, very, very tight control over art with the Académie Royale. Okay, you have artisans and then you have artists, and they're completely separate. And art is this thing which is controlled by the monarchy, basically, and it produces paintings which are to propagate the ruling elite. I mean, religious themes and themes of political, didactic things, and the whole sort of cult of the Baroque and things like that. And that whole neoclassical movement that David is associated with is a politicised art. And then he takes that, basically one of the things they do in the revolution is abolish this guild, essentially, of the Académie Royale, and say anyone can be. And he sets up, this movement where artisans and artists can join together. They take over the Louvre, actually, and they start working. And of course, the problem is that when they go around guillotining the aristocracy and they all run away, and then they also under the church, so they remove the jobs of lots of cultural workers and artisans, so they have to employ them, and so they end up with these great festivals. And that's interesting because it's a participatory festival. We now tend to see them as they have these diagrams of the floats, but we forget they're more like a carnival. They've got a political theme celebrating various revolutionary victories. But the idea behind them was that the artists would make costumes and floats and all the rest, but the people was involved. And they had enormous percentages of the population taking part in them, like Notting Hill Carnival. And they become public, so everyone gets drunk and they play music. And so so in a way, the Bastille celebrations are, particularly in the provinces, actually, I said, when they open the fire, are much closer, actually, interestingly, to that idea, political celebration. So it's a sort of art culture. That is what's lost when the counter-revolution happens, particularly once Bonaparte takes power. That's all goes. And then obviously David turns into the court painter of Bonaparte. And it's interesting, the first real avant-garde movement actually comes from his students. So they're the people who've just missed this revolutionary art movement. And so what do they do instead? Well, they have to create their own little cult, basically. They all go off to a monastery, an abandoned monastery, and they wear long hair. They're called the Barbus because they don't, and they have, basically they smoked Turkish tobacco. Guess what that was? So they get stoned, they get drunk, they have affairs with each other, and they become a sort of lifestyle. And they then become like the first romantic art movement. And then there's obviously after that, there's a succession in France. And it becomes a tradition right up to, I suppose, the situationists and people like that, postmodernists. But in a way, avant-garde art is, as an art movement, is a compensation for missing the revolution, for being born too young. Imagine that. You arrive as an artist just after it's all over. You miss the party. So what do you do instead? You form an avant-garde art move. It's like the Commune, where Courbet famously pulls down the Vendôme column and they stick it in the Louvre as a détourné piece of art. The first auto-destructive artwork. There's those sorts of things going on. I think that's, in a way, avant-garde comes after the revolution. The compensation for the revolution.
Yeah. The precedent is almost set there with this kind of revolutionary idea of art.
So David's idea, because they all read Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He wrote this famous letter to Monsieur d'Ambert on the theatre, and he contrasts the theatre, which is the spectacle. I mean, I noticed later you talk about Debord. So this really is the society of the spectacle, written in the 1760s. And not the 1960s. And he says, well, it's like people just watching other people do stuff. And also because he's a bit of a patriarch, it's also where women hang out and show off to each other. People celebrate, and they're mainly men, of course, that's the other thing. Male citizens parading together. And so, again, interestingly, that they took from that. So they did it because the French Revolution is also where feminism really starts. Women were involved in these public celebrations. I mean, also the iconography of the revolution is Marianne is a female icon. That's really what they actually aren't avant-garde. They want mass festivals, mass participation, the people making art. The avant-garde becomes what happens after the people can't make art. We have to retreat into our small groups and create little utopias. They shaved off the hair of the avant-garde artists. That's what the Bonapartist police did, and threatened the women that they would be classed as prostitutes.
Do you think that this idea that creating sort of radical art that questions status quo, etc., the idea that this itself constitutes a revolutionary action is a dangerous idea for the artist to sort of humour?
No, I think that's a really interesting, because if you think about from the point of view of the revolution, that would have made no sense. So the art was, you have a successful revolution and art is celebrated. I mean, the great example is the Festival of Reason in Notre Dame. So Notre Dame, everyone knows, is the cathedral of French Catholicism. You overthrow the church, what are you going to do to it? Well, he sets it up a temple of reason. And so when they abolish slavery in Haiti, when the Haitian Revolution succeeds, they have a big festival to celebrate this. And the radical left take this woman, who, of course, the bourgeois Jacobins denounce as a prostitute, but it was probably just some sans-culotte. She's crowned. They have like a big party in Notre Dame, and they crown her as the goddess of reason. And this shocks everyone. This is one of the reasons why you end up with the cult of the supreme being, because it's a parody. They're parodying Catholic religion and offering alternatives. And of course, as I said, it's interesting that the moment that terrifies the bourgeoisie is actually, even though they support the abolition of slavery, and see, this is a really important achievement, it actually is this public celebration when the Parisian masses decided to have a party. And so that's art for them. For them, art is a mass move. It's not a substitute for the revolution. It's a celebration of the revolution. And again, I think that's to do with the compensation. We can't have a revolution, but we can have a good party. In my lifetime, I always remember, it's like, I was involved, hard left politics in the 80s, and we went through a series of defeats. The miners were defeated, the GLC was abolished, Thatcher won the 1987 election, and then house music arrived, rave, and it was like, well, we couldn't change, it was all red wedge before then, very politicised politics. And then we couldn't change the world, but we could have a very good party. And so we sort of retreated. People retreated into clubs and created little utopian spaces. Genders and race and everything didn't matter, We created this little utopias. Temporary evening of utopia. And I think avant-garde art is a bit like that. It's a compensation for the counter-revolution. It's a memory of what might have been.
Is this related to the Californian ideology?
Corporations are, I think.
Corporations are. There is certainly an artistic bohemian aesthetic that is taken on by the Californian ideology. Right?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that shows you how it can be non-radical. Johnny Rotten, who I remember seeing in the 100 Club in 1976, being probably the most radical musician on the planet, only because he sang in a London accent, and now supports Donald Trump and Brexit. Obviously he became very rich as a property speculator in LA, so that might have something to do with it. But yeah, you can see that bohemianism. You can take those attitudes of bohemianism, radical art, and because it doesn't doesn't have a hammer and sickle on it, or even if it does have a hammer and sickle in some states, it doesn't matter. It can become the establishment. Look at the way you see it. I mean, you can see that with Stalinism. You can take all the iconography of the revolution and it becomes effectively fascism. You can't tell the difference, actually, to lots of people.
I mentioned the beats earlier. Were you influenced by do you feel that the beats were internalized within California tech culture at all?
Well, you'll be glad to know the book I'm working on at the moment, its working title is Moloch, which comes from Howl.
Oh, brilliant.
It's also in Metropolis, eating workers. Yeah, well, I think anything. See, I think you're right, Zara. I think any radical art movement, the French post actually would say it's a free-floating signifier. But so is nationalism. You say you have real difficulty celebrating 4th of July, the American Civil War. I mean, I have a picture of General Grant on my wall. You'd probably find that a bit weird. Forward to Richmond, it says on it. But you probably find that quite odd. But that's because certain things which are seen as radical and revolutionary can be like the Bastille Day. The Bastille Day can be seen as a celebration of the French elite. I mean, look at Macron went to École Nationale d'Administration, became a Rothschild banker, then was like the most right-wing minister in François Hollande's socialist government, and he's a sort of social liberal at most. So he is really a member of the elite. And yet he's the one supervising this celebration of a revolutionary victory. And, that French, the Marseillaise and the tricolour and all the rest of it can be appropriated. So I think anything like that. But it's also, I think, something like the Californian ideology, if you want to sell something as modern, innovative, you often have to take the radical ideas. You've got to recuperate them to actually give yourself a gloss. I mean, we had that discussion earlier on about the way the English dressed up their revolution in feudal clothing. Eric Hobsbawm calls it the invention of tradition. A lot of the monarchist mummery in England is actually Victorian, but most of it's late 19th century. They invented it as traditions, like state openings of parliament, things like that. Whereas now we tend to disguise it as the future. China's the classic example. They're basically a very successful, modernising capitalist country, and they disguise it as socialism with Chinese characteristics for the new era. And they have all the iconography of hammers and sickles, and you read Marx and all the rest of it. But it's just a very successful corporate state. So we disguise the future, the present as the future, rather than the present as the past.
Have you heard of Robert Conquest?
As a very right-wing historian, you mean?
Yeah.
I think the problem with people like Conquest, on an empirical level, they're often quite good because they've done a lot of research in the archive. You're never quite sure whether to trust their interpretation. The difficulty is that, the guy was a Cold War warrior. He's being funded to defend the American side in the Cold War.
The Stalin figures, many millions killed by Stalin, more or less made up its own.
I think he was a pretty murderous human being. I don't think there's any doubt that he was a counter-revolutionary. I mean, what they did, it's like disputing Mao's figure, the figures of people killed under Mao. Obviously, they massively exaggerate, this whole black book of communism. But there's no doubt that getting rid of the landlord class was done very brutally. They screwed up the famine in the late 1950s. Okay, it wasn't all their fault. There was a El Nino event, and there have been lots of famines in Chinese history for thousands of years, but nonetheless, it was made worse by maladministration. And similarly during the Cultural Revolution. I mean, I've met people whose parents were arrested, sent to concentration camps. There's no doubt these people went through violence. I don't think that's the point. I mean, when we look at history, we need to be we can't be objective, but we ought to understand that one of our things is to understand the truth and not to turn it into a myth. An American journalist asked Karl Marx what his motto was. He said, doubt everything. He said, doubt everything. If you read his stuff, he's always going back and checking and trying to find some new fact, Conquest I wouldn't dismiss. Some people say, oh, he's just a Cold War warrior, you can't trust anything. But so there's probably some stuff in there which are really good because they were, obviously the Stalinist historians were ignoring it. On the other hand, when it becomes a justification for Ukrainian fascists, you start to think it's a bit dodgy. I went to Livy where they have a statue of a fascist collaborator outside the railway station because they'd just rewritten history from the other side. Very strange.
In the French Revolution, we also see experiments in popular assemblies in the form of the Paris sections.
Yeah.
So I wanted to sort of ask, to what extent is the French Revolution a kind of participatory project from below, and to what extent is it a sort of revolution administered from above? Again,
these popular assemblies weren't anything new. Mm-hmm. I think that's the first thing you have to think about. If you read I said Machiavelli's the Discourses. The people assemble, or the men, because he's all about males here, assemble and they decide as citizens what should be done. That's how Florence was partly run in the Renaissance. Okay, the Medicis and the oligarchs made sure it was under strict control, but there were key moments when, and certainly if you're a Republican like Machiavelli, that's what you want. You want the citizen assembly to. So there was a long tradition of this, going back to feudal city-states, not just the Renaissance, but also going obviously further back to Rome and Athens. And then you could go, Marx again, who we talked about, he was interested in anthropology. Villages would meet, assemblies would meet, they would decide, right back to tribal assembly. They were really into the Iroquois, Marx and Engels. The guy Henry Morgan wrote this Ancient Society. And that was run through meetings, actually with women there as well. So the Paris sections were coming out of this long tradition. And he said in the American Revolution, they have town hall meetings, all these key moments in New England where in Lexington, they would all the men would get together in one of those big town halls. I actually did with the child visit, and then they would decide they're going to go and shoot the Brits. So that was part of it, and the sections are really interesting because Paris is a large city, and so you have all these areas where people live. That's what a section is. It's sort of like quartier today, and they would meet. And first, it just started off with the men with property, and then the men without property would start turning up as it radicalized. And then at the really radical part of the revolution, the women were there as well. So that was like a participatory democracy and really radical. I mean, I think the thing was radical about the French Revolution that people forget is not so much that men without property were participating, because that happened in the English Revolution and to a lesser extent in the American Revolution. It was that women started participating as citizens. And that's really the key difference. Yeah, so that gave a tradition. So if you go through the 19th century and 20th century, the Soviets in the radical part of the Russian Revolution, they're very much seen as a descendant of the Paris Workers' Council, the whole council, communists. Zara said she's into CLR James, so CLR coming out of that Workers' Council tradition. And that, again, CLR James makes this connection between the Paris sections and Petrograd's Soviets and all the rest of it, and workers' councils, right up to 1960s and 1970s. The New Left make the same thing. So, yeah, I think that is an important tradition. Direct democracy. People getting together in a physical space and making decisions. It's not radically new, but they did play a key role in the revolution, and particularly in radicalising, because if you look at what are called the Genèse, these moments where the Paris mob intervenes and basically pushes out the right at various points, they are organised in the sections. The way that the people, when they go to Versailles and bring the monarchy back and this sort of thing, this is the sections organising, including women. So there's that is definitely part of it. But obviously what they're doing is also controlling a state. And that becomes increasingly top down. As the state is, first the Jacobins take it over, and then eventually Bonaparte, it becomes a much more authoritarian thing. But you have to understand these two things are together. There's a representative democracy, the National Assembly, or the National Convention as it becomes, which is a representative democracy, and this sort of direct democracy in Paris mainly, but also in Lyon and other places around the country. People are directly involved in it. And also in the countryside to a lesser extent. But it's both, I would say.
Is there some tension between those two sides?
Yeah, of course, because at the end of the day, when obviously Robespierre and Saint-Just, as they sort of slowly guillotine all their rivals, that what they do is they start guillotining the radical left. Well, Jacques Roux commits suicide, but Hébert, people like that, the Emirati basically suppress the radical left of the Paris section. And then they fall from power. Once they're no longer propped up by the Paris section, then people in the convention can organise against them and chop their heads off. And that becomes the Directory, which then becomes Bonaparte and the Empire. They both need each other. I think this is the interesting. And again, if you look at the German Revolution, 1919, people like Karl Kautsky say this. Well, it's not workers' councils replacing the parliament. That's usually the sort of Bolshevik myth. We don't like parliamentary democracy, it's bourgeois and all the rest of it, and we want workers' councils instead. Or you have the other side who say the workers' councils are just anarchistic and taken over by extreme. And he says, no, Kautsky says, no, you need both. You need these local direct democracy to keep the republic on, but it has to also, you have to control the state through some some form of parliamentary democracy. It's that tension between the two, which the left in the 20th century found very difficult to do. Famously, when the Bolsheviks dissolved the Constituent Assembly, they didn't actually replace it with a Soviet republic. They replaced it with a party dictatorship. Somebody had to control the state, and if it wasn't going to be the Constituent Assembly, it was the Bolsheviks, the self-appointed leaders of the revolution.
So one of the other things I like about your Class War Games book is the way that it makes us rethink philosophers in relation to the French Revolution. So Rousseau is cast as an almost proto-Deborian.
Yeah, totally. I think he is completely proto-Deborian. You read The Society of the Spectacle. It's a brilliant piece of synthesis. A lot of it is Ludwig Feuerbach, The Essence of Christianity. My PhD supervisor, David McClellan, pointed out. I actually still have the copy he gave to me. He said, this is where your favourite philosopher favourite theorist got all his ideas. But also, I think it is this, the letter to Monsieur Dambert on the theatre. The Boer was, is well aware of that because he comes out, he's very interested in the French Revolution. He invented a board game based on the French Revolution. And I think once you actually understand French history, obviously Rousseau's remains aren't in the pantheon. He is the main theorist of the French Revolution, including its more patriarchal parts.
Rousseau on the one hand, and then your reading of Hegel as a Bonapartist.
That is what I think is really interesting, is that I've got quite a lot of books on Hegel, and they just pass over his Bonapartism. He's always seen as, sometimes they see him as a sort of a Jacobin, or they see him as an apologist for the King of Prussia, where it's not, which is just ridiculous in my view. The Phenomenology of the Spirit famously is published after the Battle of Jena. He says, I saw the world's spirit on the horseback as Bonaparte arrives in Jena. But it's also that, he ran a Bonapartist newspaper during the French rule in Germany. And I think his brother and his brother-in-law died in the 1812 invasion of Russia. So after the war, after the fall of Bonaparte, he has to sort of hide his politics to a certain extent. But he used to celebrate Bastille Day every day. There's his famous story. He's in some inn and he suddenly announces to his students it's Bastille Day and buys all the champagne in the inn so they can all celebrate it. I think he sees Bonaparte as the resolution, because he's a dialectician. So he thinks there's absolute liberty, which is the mob rule. And it's interesting, he sees the party, the great party in Notre Dame as an example of this, where they're celebrating the end of slavery. The Festival of Reason is a good example. And then the other side is absolute tyranny, which is absolute monarchy. And Bonaparte is like the third way between the two. Yeah, he's a citizen emperor. He's like the elected emperor. Yeah, and he's enlightened and all the rest of it. I just think he's a corrupt maniac. But you can see, and again, you can see that with the cult of other revolutionary leaders, counter-revolution. Mao was a good example we were talking about, or earlier, Lenin or people like that. Cromwell. Why is Cromwell outside of the Houses of Parliament? Because he secured the victory of Parliament. And people say, he dissolved Parliament, blah, blah, blah. He turned himself into a sort of king. But actually, without his, reorganisation of the model army, him and Fairfax leading it to victory, we were, the absolutist monarchy might have won. He is our first prime minister.
Could I go back and ask what links you see? Because I know quite a bit about Rousseau, but then not that much about Guy Debord. What are the links that your supervisor saw and that you see between Rousseau and...
Well, you have to understand, this was when where was this? This was like 1980, 40 years ago, whenever I was doing my PhD. And so this is a guy, David McClellan. He's a Marxologist. He was a liberation theologist, actually. That was his students, even today. His sort of introduction to Marx is what lots of undergraduates read. For this PhD group, he used to collect different types of Marxists. So there were like 4 different types of Trotskyists and 2 Stalinists and 1 Maoist. And I was the council communist, as I know. Actually, there was one other council. I was the punk council communist, and the other guy was the sort of anti-parliamentary opposition. He was English, but he lived in Germany. A council communist. So we were the council communists. Because he knew I was really into Boer. He said this is really where it's Feuerbach. But the Rousseau connection I think is very interesting, because if you're from the French left, that's really true, because Rousseau is the first great theorist of the French. And of course, if we were talking earlier about Paris sections, Rousseau's really into direct democracy. His view is democracy is only when all the men get together and stand there or sit there and argue and debate until everybody is agreed. 98%. It's consensus democracy of the world. A long time ago, I taught a Swiss student. She was a green socialist feminist. And she said until she was about 16, her village had operated according to Rousseau. that they would all get in a field, march, and the banners of the village, they'd all march to a field, and they would debate the key things about the village, the men, and they would try never to disagree, because disagreeing splits the village. So you would have to come to a consensus, and that's the general will. And of course, the problem is that, there's two interesting things about that story. Is first, they gave women the vote, which she said, as a green socialist feminist, somehow she said was actually in some ways less democratic, because then the village was taken over by representatives, including women, but it wasn't as participatory, because she said at least the wives could tell the husbands how to vote. So, she was talking, theoretically. The other interesting thing is, as I said, is the way that what happens if it gets too large. So the thing about Paris or any direct democracy is it works if you can have a big hall and everyone sit there and they can come to a consensus. But if it's too large, all you have, as happened in the French Revolution, class differences, which become ideological differences, it starts to break down. You can't form that consensus. Now people use, me and Ava have been working on this, trying to use digital democracy tools. Things like Polis. The Polis software tries to create consensus, and you can get tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people to try and form consensuses. It's a very potent form of democracy, but it's difficult to administer on a large scale. So if you want a Swiss village, or in a case of Rousseau, he was a watchmaker's son. So that would have been an artisan trade community. So you're talking, in Geneva, the watchmakers were probably a few hundred. So they could all get together and decide how the trade was being run. But it becomes very difficult to scale it up. Certainly once you get to a city size, let alone a national size. And that's where, someone like Hegel would say you have to have some other solution. The emperor, in his case, the world spirit. And that's the problem. Then it becomes taken over by the president, the leader, or the oligarchy. The many. How do the many rule themselves? See, Machiavelli has this wonderful thing where he says you can only trust the people. And one of the reasons you can only trust the people is because they actually really don't want to run the state. They just want the state to function in their interests. And they said the problem with leaders and oligarchs is they want to run the state so they benefit. And I think that's a really interesting, and it's been, that he's talking in the early 16th century, and we're essentially here we are in the early 21st century in the same problem, being run by algorithmic shysters.
It's sort of implying everybody's selfish.
Yeah, but that selfishness comes out of not creating collective structures to become citizens. The Greeks would say an idiot is somebody who isn't a citizen. And so people learn to be social, don't they? By participating, they learn. We're taught we deliberately atomise and depoliticise the population. They will act like idiots, like, not wearing face masks during a pandemic because they read it on the Daily Mail or Spite or whatever. It's against my liberty, against my human rights to infect everyone else.
Don't need to put on the American accent. It's more likely to happen in the UK than in America, I think, now.
Well, no, I was just thinking because I was watching this. I was just watching this thing the other day. They were interviewing someone in somewhere or other. Probably Florida. They don't necessarily, it's their human right, though, because they're America, they're liberal. They have the whole amendments of the Constitution. I didn't know one of the amendments of the Constitution was you don't have to wear a face mask.
I saw a great video, that bears just reciting slightly to show how kind of ludicrous the whole thing is, where a woman who was speaking at an like a pro-liberty, anti-face mask demonstration in Washington, D.C. went, "I'm sorry, I have to cut my speech short now because my children are very sick and in the car." And then kind of unironically dismissed herself to cheering and applauding, and it kind of goes to show this sort of cognitive break.
But it also comes back to the liberalism. Liberalism, the great counter-revolutionary text of the 1641 revolution is Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, where he recuperates the social contract for the right. And what's interesting about that, he says this, that people are just interested in themselves and their family and making money, and they should abdicate all the power to the authorities, essentially, to the sovereign. And you're just an individual who has liked appetites and aversions. In a way, that's like, that's what a really authoritarian liberalism is, a very strong part of Western culture. It's funny how here we are in the early 21st century and it's still there. As I said, people, again, they think, well, everyone else should wear a face mask, but I don't have to. Whereas, of course, the whole point is everyone has to wear one. It's just social self-discipline. It's just interesting how we've been taught not to do that. If you're a citizen, you wouldn't think about it. He would say, I want to look after my fellow citizens. And you learn that by participating in collective organisation. The militia. If you go to Amsterdam, they have these great Van Dyck paintings, the militia, which was obviously a lot of male drinking club as much as anything else. And they all there in their finery, with the idea that they were actually going to fight anyone by that stage seemed long after the revolt. It's interesting where they had these social organisations, even the bourgeoisie, who were obviously involved in competition with each other. But it's the other side of Adam Smith, theory of moral sentiments. To have a market economy, you also have to have sociability, where people come together. And the French Revolution plays with those two sides. It's setting up a modern economy, it's sweeping away all the feudal restriction on property and competition and things like that. But on the other hand, it's demanding that people are a citizen. They're both bourgeois and citizen. It's citizenship that we've forgotten. The last 40 years of neoliberalism, they've forgotten how to be citizen. And in a way, as I said, it's funny that we celebrate markets, but you can't have markets without citizenship, because they saw citizenship as a threat to the wealthy, the oligarchs. Send everyone back. Close down the sections. Professionalise the army. Don't have public celebrations. Turn art back into a spectacle. Yes, you're right, Zara. It's a nationalist idea. But again, patriotism was a left-wing idea in the 17th, 18th and 19th century.
Arguably, that was the rise of the mercantiles, the mercantilist origin, the modernization. But the left communists, like Bordiga, point to these Republican attempts as just modernizing.
But Bordiga's himself part of that process.
He's like the rear guard of it, arguably, whereas Lenin was the initial sweep.
Bordiga celebrated the bourgeois revolution with red flags in Russia. He actually believed that they were going to put the Soviet constitution into effect. If you read the 1990 constitution of the Russian Soviet Federal Socialist Republics, he actually thought that you can read articles about it, he thinks it's actually operating. It's a complete fantasy. They were closing down the Soviets then. So he really bought into the whole fantasy of the Russian Revolution.
He was more Leninist than Lenin. He bought into it more than Lenin did, right?
Well, because it was a fantasy. And also he helped split the Italian Socialist Party at the key moment when the fascists were coming to power. You're getting sidetracked here, but I think come back to the question, which is about Hegel and Rousseau. Again, it's how do we appropriate these people now? They're historical characters. It's interesting that Hegel is not situated in his moment of being a Bonapartist for various different reasons. Now, Alexander Kojève, of course, is the...
Well, Hegel was quite known for being a Bonapartist.
Yeah, but actually, if you look at the academic stuff, and even lots of the left stuff, they don't really stress that. Because I think the whole Bonapartist is Stalin.
Isn't that because Hegel's tried to abstract himself from any sort of ideological position by being this observer of historical materialism?
He had to write.
But he quite clearly is when you kind of read his actual wording. And for example, the word spirit quote that you quoted earlier.
Code. He's writing under an authoritarian system. So he has to, after 1815, he has to write in code.
But it's also because...
he was also a Freemason, so Freemasons knew how to use symbolic language to express what they really thought.
But even within that, we have this idea that sort of Hegel stands outside of history and is able to interpret history through his dialectic. And we bring this back to Hegel himself, whereas I think there's very little understanding. I mean, E.P. Thompson alluded to it. Raymond Williams wrote about it a little bit. It's about how this idea of dialectic understanding of history is itself rooted in the material conditions of the time. Well, we all seem to have forgotten about that.
Of course, yeah.
We all seem to have...
I said Zara's into C.L.R. James. I mean, he writes books on dialectics because he sees it as a revolutionary philosophy, whatever that means. It can be seen as quite a reactionary philosophy in other cases. I'm not sure whether even philosophy can be revolutionary. I think that's it. And if you read Marx, you would probably think it can't be. I think it's more to that. What we're talking about here is about the French Revolution, all these particular characters, is they exist in two time zones. One is their own, and in a way to understand them, you actually have to look at their historical circumstances. Ad hominem. In academia, this is seen as the worst thing, but I always think if you don't understand them in their circumstances, you can't understand them at all. They then exist in another way, which is how they're appropriated today. So certainly a lot of standard academic stuff is they just appropriate these people as just sort of abstract ideas, as free-floating ideas.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. And, whole
that's very much my point,
structuralism has encouraged all the worst types of that. You know, like, so you have these charlatans like Alan Badger and these sorts of people.
Zizek.
I can't take people like that seriously, to be honest. Plows through lots of negri. That's something I'm writing. That's the person who went downhill. The stuff he wrote in the 70s is really good.
Yes.
Went to Paris and met Foucault and Deleuze, and then everything else since then has been a bit naff.
If you want to understand things in terms of structural cause and effect, he didn't choose to go to Paris.
Don't read Deleuze, it rots your brain.
Can I counter that recommendation? Please read Deleuze. It will build your brain.
I say read Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Read Maurice Merleau-Ponty instead.
Oh no, phenomenology.
Hippolyte. Jean Hippolyte. Still, you know, even though I became a member of the Labour Party many decades ago, I still think base level I'm a Guy Debord fan.
I mean, I think most people, I think nearly everybody, regardless of political kind of affiliation, can appreciate Debord's kind of insight into...
I'm teaching to 20-year-olds. Amazing, even now, you get people that have the same thing the first time you read Society of the Spectacle. It was like taking acid for the first time.
Yeah!
You couldn't see the world in a different way for a long time after. Dave McClellan and whatever. Since then, I've read Hegel and Rousseau and Feuerbach and all these leftists, Bordiger and so on, Council, and you realise where he got it all from. But just as an act of synthesis. In the same way Marx did the same thing. You know, he just said this is that great book about the guy who was in the lettrists with him. And they said that they just knew Debord as this sort of, you know, rather drunken avant-garde artist. And then he met him like 6 years later when he was just about to publish his article, and he said, "What have you been doing?" He said, "Reading lots of books." And I thought, yeah, exactly. It's an impressive piece of study and synthesis. Doing that and inventing the jeu de la guerre, that's two great achievements.
In Marx's The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, Marx reports on the revolutionary crisis of 1849 to 1852. He tells us that precisely in such epochs of revolutionary crisis, they timidly conjure up the spirit of the past to help them. They borrow their names, slogans, and costumes so as to stage the new world historical in its venerable disguises and borrowed language. To what extent has the French Revolution become a kind of costume for historical events that are...
Time as tragedy, second time as farce, and all the rest, even though Hegel never did say it. Well, he makes the point, though, doesn't he? You know, if you look at it, he says, you know, the 1641 English Revolution, they all think they're from the Old Testament. They dress up as if they are the Israelites, creating the covenant and all the rest of it. And then, as he says, the French Revolution, and we talked about this early on, they dress up as Roman republicans. Or the Greeks to a lesser extent, but mainly the Roman Republic, because I said they'd all read Livy through Machiavelli. Partly, I think it's inevitable. I mean, if we look at the 20th century revolutions, the Russian Revolution, all think they're rerunning the French Revolution. And, you know, certainly the Chinese, they're both looking back to their own history, peasant revolts, successful peasant revolutions, when the mandate of heaven was removed and installed on another group, but also looking at the French Revolution particularly. I think it comes back to it. It's because it's such an archetypical revolution for two reasons. I think first because it's a very radical revolution in that the masses are involved. The key thing is ordinary people. It's the fish sellers, the female fish sellers who lead the mob to Versailles to bring back the monarchy. The people who stormed the Bastille, they've actually done this wonderful survey of the people who got the medals for Georges Roudet did this thing where they went and looked at the records of who the people who got medals for storming the Bastille. Yeah, they're not down and outs. These are people like shopkeepers and artisans, and they're not poor people, but they're not rich people. They're all petty bourgeois, as I think, in a positive sense of the word. Radical, popular, mass revolution side. And it's also the other side, because it's also a modernising capitalist revolution. And almost every revolution we've had has had those two sides to it. The Chinese revolution is, you know, the one that's in the news at the moment, because we're all supposed to hate China because it's been too successful. It's modernised itself successfully and is now about to overtake America in 5G and artificial intelligence or whatever, chip manufacturing. There's always those two sides to it. It's interesting about denying one side or the other. So, you know, we talked about this earlier on about denying the English Revolution had a radical side, certainly officially. And again, in America, the fact that the American Civil War isn't celebrated as a great revolution, which it was. So it's become the model. I think it has become the model. And also it's just exciting. It's great. It's very well documented. I think that's the other thing we forget. Pre-photography, it's just pre-photography. But printing was really successful by that. The English Revolution is the first real print revolution. Certainly by the end of the 18th century, they had lots of the technology of making books, pamphlets, prints, distribute, something like The Death of Marat by Jacques-Louis David. And we see it as a painting, but this was turned into thousands, hundreds of thousands of prints. He was a sort of Republican Jesus. He does look like he's just been taken down from the cross. And that was an image that was everywhere, and not just in France, all over Europe, as the Republican martyr. So we forget that. I think that's the other thing. And so then when later revolutions come along and they are even more mediatized, they build on those images of the French Revolution. And of course, as I said, it's Republican, and it does have the best pop song ever to celebrate a revolution, apart from the Internationale. There's that wonderful bit in Casablanca where they sing out the Nazis, isn't it? And I just shared on Facebook, there's this great film which was done during the Popular Front period by Jean Renoir called La Marseillaise, which is a wonderful piece of sort of left patriotic and saving the republic from, which is basically fascism.
Doesn't it seem that like the idea of being able to sing out entire system of domination and oppression is exactly this like beautiful liberal idea where it completely denies I don't know, I think liberals kind of celebrate it. I think there are a lot of liberal punk bands and hip-hop artists who think that via sort of verbal, like lyrical critique of the state, they accomplish something substantial and tangible, where it seems it might actually reinforce it via a kind of negative, weird inversion.
Yeah, no, I agree. I completely agree with you, Matt. I mean, that is, absolutely spot on. It's a Republican. I think this is one of the reasons why it's interesting, because in my lifetime, because I'm sort of a late boomer, I guess I would be counted as. I grew up when the left was very anti-statist, and in a way it paralleled what neoliberalism is. So if you look at something, like someone like Tony Negri, I always think is a left wing of neoliberalism, really. And a lot of that sort of autonomist, and there's a certain, councilist, which there is an element of it which becomes basically left neoliberalism. That's where something like the Marseillaise or the whole French Republican tradition, which they very consciously rejected because they saw it as Stalinist, as nationalist, because they were the generation, their parents had been involved, some of them obviously collaborated, but those who hadn't tended to be Stalinist, because the Stalinists were the key people in the resistance, or they were very close. Even Gaullism is a sort of conservative version. They're very statist, nationalistic, militaristic, and they very consciously, that generation, rejected it. Because the difficulty is then they evacuated the Republic to the right. And then you get this ridiculous. I always remember when the Front National appeared, and I said was that really strange thing of seeing Marine Le Pen and all these Catholic fascists singing the Marseillaise. When they are the impure blood. They probably thought that the impure blood were Arabs and Jews, but actually the impure blood is theirs. But the right got the state because the left wouldn't think about the Republic. People like Jean-Luc Mélenchon, France Insoumise, have tried to do that. But again, they've sort of ended up in this sort of rather strange sort of sovereignist position where they sound a bit like Lexitus or something. It's going to come back. It's partly because of the success of China. Here we have almost a classic 1950s, 60s mixed economy. Okay, it's an authoritarian government, but it's a mixture of state planning and market competition. And they very consciously have, China 2025, we will build, they're going to replace all petrol cars with electric cars. So we have a plan where we're going to have everybody installing electric vehicle charging points over the country, which we can't do. We can't even get people to wear face masks. So that sort of thing is obviously coming back. But the question is, how do we engage with it where it doesn't become, the red-brown alliance, where you end up like a lot of the Lexiters here, where they start to sound like fascists. They start talking about the white working class, whatever that means. I'm not sure what that means in London.
Trying to segregate race from class.
Well, and also, they're importing these terms from America, where it doesn't even really make sense in America. There are, W.E.B. always talks about the wages of whiteness. I always think, the American Civil War, why it should be celebrated, because hundreds of thousands of white people went out and got themselves killed and maimed to help liberate the slaves. And they knew that's what they were doing as well, contrary to the lost cause myth. It's how do you re-engage with republicanism? And certainly, if you know, before 1940, the left was unashamedly Republican. Friedrich Engels critiqued the German Social Democratic Party for the Erfurt program because they weren't openly Republican. And, you know, the left here would say, well, we're Chartists, we want the Republic, we want, you know, they really were into ideas like social contract. And the problem is that the working class are not part of the social contract. And we're not against human rights. On the contrary, we think human rights should be not just civil rights and political rights, but socio-economic. We should have a right to housing. We should have a right to healthcare. The NHS comes out of this idea. We should have free education, free healthcare, and free housing.
Are these global ideas, or are these Republican ideas that stay nationalised? That's the whole Marx's assertion, was that, you know, this thing spreads, becomes a global thing.
We have to start where we are. But yeah, they set up an international, you know, we talked about Henri de Saint-Simon earlier in 1814, which is a long time ago, 1840. Bonaparte's empire was collapsing, and he said we should replace it with a united Europe, Republican Europe. And that's 200 years ago, and we haven't even got there yet. And we're still squabbling about trying to push liberal Europe into a slightly more democratic form. I had these Chinese students last year, and it was really great. One of them said to me, I don't understand why Europeans keep squabbling with each other. Why don't you form a strong centralised state like we did? It's been very successful. Because basically, if you're Chinese, all Europeans look the same. And their countries have equally got linguistic diversity, cultural diversity. They get it in a way. They say, well, you know, if we have democracy and peace, it's got to be through creating this large state. Whereas we think, instinctively, this is terrible. America is a confederation. You know, America at the moment, its problem is that it's not got a strong enough federal state to deal with the pandemic. They've left it to all the states to run around like headless chicken.
The French Revolution becomes a kind of inspiration for a kind of slave rebellion.
Yeah.
Colonialists.
True. I think what the French Revolution did was weaken the slave power by dividing the whites and setting the Creoles like demands that they were included. And that then opened a way for the slaves to rebel. And then once the Jacobins come to power, who are ideologically opposed to slavery, they then embrace republicanism. And then, of course, they become more Republican than the Republican. They hold on to republicanism long after Bonaparte. Bonaparte tries to reintroduce slavery.
I just think this is an interesting way in which the sort of revolution sort of travels.
And if you look at the dictionary of the French Revolution, which Francois Fleuret issued in where it was the late 1980s, it doesn't have Toussaint Louverture in it. No Haitians in it at all. Even if you just think it's a French Revolution, what the rebellion in the colonies was incredibly important. It was part of the Gironde, the liberals, made their money out of the Caribbean. That's the Gironde is on the west coast of France. And so the fact that there was a rebellion in Haiti, the most profitable economy, cut their money supply. One of the reasons why the Jacobins in Paris could take power, because the liberals suddenly lost their money. But it was that whole revisionist history just ignored all that. And also it makes the Jacobins look really good, because they were, even Robespierre, famously when the guys, the ex-slave, the mulatto, the Creole, arrive with there's three of them. There's a white, a brown and a black, and they arrive at the National Convention, and the whole convention stands up and cheers them, because this represents what the revolution is. The abolition of the aristocracy of blood, of skin as well. But that was really important. It wasn't just a tactical thing. It was part of Rousseau, actually. All men are equal, unlike the American Revolution. White men are equal. Thomas Jefferson says that for all these all men are equal. But of course, he doesn't mean it for his private property.
Yeah.
C.L.R. James did a really great service to us. And it's a fabulous book. As I discovered from writing Class War Games, that it's slightly fabricated, romanticised parts of it. It changed the narrative. Because the usual treatment of Toussaint Louverture is he's the Black Napoleon. When he isn't really, or he's not, because he's more, in some ways, he's more of a political leader. So he's more like the Black Robespierre, if anything. But that, again, so to make him out as a Jacobin, I think was really important. C.L.R. James was a Trotskyist. We recognise the close similarity between Jacobinism and Trotskyism.
Your new book is on the States. I just wanted to actually ask you about that book, but also to what extent have the events of 1789 and after sort of shaped this kind of standing of the state.
The key thing I want to do is rehabilitate English republicans. I think, because that's where I think a lot of the debates of, this distinction between the bourgeois and proletarian revolutions Again, that sort of stuff became very unfashionable, particularly after the collapse of Stalinism. I think it's something that really needs to be thought through again. If we are going to have radical social change, we're hitting, this pandemic, neoliberalism is obviously coming to an end, propping up asset prices like mad by the printing as many dollars as they can. The curious thing is about how do we think about that? And as I said, I obviously have friends who are leading the Labour Party. Like 2017 and 2019 Labour manifestos are, in many ways, very, very good documents. But what's interesting is they ignore the constitutional issue completely. It's seen as an add-on. Whereas I'm just wondering whether it may be in 5-10 years' time, particularly if there's Scottish independence, we won't be able to do that anymore. We need to actually think about how do people become citizens. If we want to make people take responsibility for their own lives, this social self-discipline in a democratic way, we have to start teaching people to be citizens again. Taking some of these ideas from, we can call it the bourgeois revolution, I think is really important. And again, before 1914, this wouldn't have been seen as weird. It's only actually since these whole modernising revolutions that happened and the experiences of the two world wars that we've found it really difficult to talk about that. So at the moment I'm writing a book about basically different left state theories, mainly from the 20th century. So during these Black Lives Matter demos in Seattle, they set up this thing called CHAZ, Capital Autonomous Zone, which they claimed was the Paris Commune reborn, where it obviously isn't. Eventually they said it was an occupied area or something, organised protest, I think they called it. But it's interesting that they would think that they would think that essentially what's a sit-in is actually a different form of political organisation, when that's what it isn't. Seattle City Council knew that and let them alone until it collapsed of its own accord. That whole idea about how do we think about reorganising democracy in the 21st century means that we, in a way, have to think about it again. Zara earlier was talking about Bordiga. Bordiga rejected the Democratic Republic. And of course, the problem with, in Italy, after the First World War, it really did become a democracy for the first time. We had certainly universal male suffrage. And that destabilised the republic, or the monarchy as it was a crowned republic, which then opened the way to fascism. By not engaging in the constitutional issue and just saying, we've got this magical solution called workers' councils, Soviets, they actually opened the way for Mussolini to turn himself into dictator. Lenin complained, and Trotsky complained, that their supporters in Italy hadn't recruited Mussolini because they regarded him, because they knew him obviously from before the First World War, they regarded him as the only competent politician on the Italian left.
Is your current project essentially looking at these left alternative to, I suppose, the states that they were attempting to negate in some way? Obviously it's very difficult to kind of leave your ideology at the door. What is the end goal of the project? Is it just a historiography kind of thing?
Well, so I'm trying to write local books. Instead of writing one long book, it's essentially this first one is like a literature review, as I would say to PhD students. What I'd like to do in the second volume is do it like rehabilitate social contract theory for the left.
Okay.
That is seen as the ultimate sin. Or anything, basically since the Russian Revolution, the worst thing you can be on there is a social contract theory. Whereas what I think is interesting, and this is where I'm, being English, having read Chartist, you can see my other great influence, apart from Guy Debord, is Edward Thompson. They were very self-consciously. They came out of the Leveller tradition, the radical Whigs and the Chartists. Their vision of the state was very different. It's the withering away of the state. At some point, we will then move to a new society where the state becomes obsolete. But in the meantime, it's there. It's a fetishised social relation. It's like the firm. They don't say we're going to just abolish the firm overnight. I really like them, the communisation theories, which I think, they have very interesting theoretical insight. But how do you get the milk delivered in the morning? Well, as they used to say in May 68, this person telling me a long time ago who'd been in May 68, and he said the revolution stopped when people couldn't get milk delivered.
Doesn't that seem to imply some direct link between actual governance?
And I thought that was a really interesting critique. And he was very involved in it and really still...
What I mean is it's absurd. Surely you can self-organise from a base level, the delivery of milk. God, if you can't, then what's the point of any kind of left?
That's what they didn't think. He was involved in the cooperative movement. I can't remember if he was a Pabloist or he was just on the left of the PS. Socialist Party. But that's why he was involved in the cooperative movement, because he said that's part of the problem. Is that, the Mitterrand, and the classic example is the Mitterrand government. They got to this stage, they reflated the economy, they did some nationalisation, and then they got to the sort of Brexit deadline, essentially, is what we're about to hit at the end of December, where they had to make a choice, either to leave what's in the European community and put a big wall around the hexagon, like Gracchus Babeuf wanted to do with the conspiracy of equal, or they had to accept that the country was so integrated with the rest of Europe, they couldn't do it by themselves. And he said, well, the problem was that they were so obsessed with the state, in the wrong sense, government. The state is a means to an end, which is why he was interested in the cooperative movement. And so I think it's those two sides of it. Well, on the one hand, we don't think about the state seriously. So they didn't, for instance, looking at the example of the Mitterrand government, which was like the Labour left. It's as if the hard left had taken power in Britain in the 80s, but more so, because obviously the French state was much stronger than the British state in the economy because of the Stalinist, Gaullist influence. What's interesting about that is that they didn't reform the state. So they didn't abolish the monarchical presidency. They did a little bit of federalism, of decentralisation, but they didn't set up a federal republic like in Germany. They made some changes to the electoral system, but not really. So it was interesting how little they did of constitutional democratisation. And then their vision of the economy was very top down and not like empowering people. Not thinking that citizenship was the most important. So you want to get people involved in political decisions and involved in social decisions and involved in economic decisions. That sort of goes back to the council communists and the situationists. That's the good bit of it, which is, it's participation. The problem with modern society is everyone becomes passive consumers. They just obey orders. In the workplace, they can passively consume at home. Politics is reduced to a choice between Pepsi and Cola. When I was involved in the GLC, that was one thing that I thought was good about the people involved in that, people like John McDonnell, was that they thought about things like that. And they tried to actually think beyond just the usual left programme, just Fabianism, basically. Sort of a combination of Fabianism and Stalinism, which is what the French and English left usually have. And a lot of this whole Lexit thing is just like a sort of nostalgia for some sort of state capitalism in one country with the white working class, whoever they are, the mythical white working class.
There's a lot of this idea as if people they're not controlled and they're not sort of told what to do. It becomes anarchy, and then nothing like milk doesn't get delivered or something like that.
And that they think the wrong things, or they don't behave properly. They say, oh, well, they don't, they're not going to vote the right way, they're too selfish, whatever. We can make those critiques, the deplorables critique. But the trouble is, unless people are citizens, they're going to behave like that, because they've been, certainly in this country, they've been told to act selfishly for 40 years. When
you say citizen, how would you define that term?
Well, I was thinking, we're talking about the French Revolution. So they had a very, as I said, it comes out of their reading of the classics, of course, particularly the Roman, the Renaissance interpretation, and to a less extent Greek texts, that your purpose in life is to not just to make money or have a family or whatever, it's to be a citizen. Again, it's a very patriarchal view. I think we have to be careful today about this. And one of the good things about the French Revolution is it started to break with this, is that, men go out and they take part in collective bonding activities like festivals, the militia, and part in assemblies deciding how they should collectively run things. And that's actually what's important. That what's important is their life as a citizen. And see how it's patriarchal, because the women have to stay at home looking after the kids. And the shop, actually. The other thing, if you're Rousseau, of course, as an artisan, the artisan has a shop, where the workshop, and so the wife would be customer end, and the man would be in the back room doing whatever they're making.
It sounds like that is quite top down, in the sense that they're doing these exercises, militia exercises, and that's
completely bottom up. They elect their own officers. It's our vision of direct democracy, workers' councils.
Is there an element that they conceive it? Of a sort of natural organisation taking over in those circumstances. Is there any idea of that?
I think, again, we have to distinguish between the French Revolution and then how it was seen in the 19th and early 20th century socialist movement. Because obviously once you get the proletariat and once you get women involved, it's going to change, because you're going to have a very different view of what citizenship means if you think it's all adults. Adults also include the youth. And it's what we were talking about earlier on. How do you scale up this? You can see that you could have all adults together if they have childcare. If they have creches, you could do it quite easily. The interesting thing then is how do you teach people? I mean, I've got a 6-year-old son, and I was real good when we were going voting, and he was like, as I was discussing it, that somebody wanted to reduce the voting age to 16, and then someone else says 11, and Artie says, why can't I vote? And I thought, yeah, well, actually, he's correct. Why can't you? You know, if you're going to teach them to be citizens, they should start at an early age. That would be a really good idea. Get children to vote. I thought that was excellent. I thought that was a very astute comment by him. So it's about having that idea that people can control their own lives, even at a very school level, and to teach people to do that. Because as I say, you know, we've just been talking on and off about this problem of the Westerners lacking social self-discipline. Well, it's because they've not been taught it. They've not been taught to operate in groups very well. They've spent 40 years destroying groups, trade unions, political parties, social organisations of various kinds, very consciously, actually, because they're seen as dangerous. You know, the Stalinists did the same. Any group had to be controlled by the totalitarian party. You know, you couldn't have a chess club because it might be used as a Trotskyist conspiracy. And in a sense, neoliberals think the same thing. You know, Thatcher's think there's no such thing as society, only individuals and their families. Says she, quoting Friedrich von Hayek, the Constitution of Liberty. You know, the only freedom is buying and selling to each other. Everything else is not freedom, because it's not a voluntary arrangement. And that's what the French Republicans, and even to an extent the French liberal, rejected, because they saw people were both bourgeois and citizens, and later on they saw they were both people and citizens, actually, or men and citizens, to be more precise. And then eventually they thought they were people. And that's something we need to think about again, I think. And as I said, I'm just interested in going through various left theories, because they try to grasp at that. But the problem is, as I said, it's the difficulty of the parliamentary republic, because you've got this split where social democrats basically keep democracy and dump socialism. And then what the so-called communists, they keep socialism and dump democracy. That became a real problem. And that includes the radical left, who see themselves as critics of Stalinism.
Are you familiar with what was happening with like the Gilets jaunes in France? What happened was that everybody was protesting, and their idea, a lot of the people that you spoke to, you know, the media chose to interview, were saying, well, we don't really feel we're any party. And then, but from that, it seemed like a sort of natural organisation started to happen, and certain leaders, you know, men and women, actually started to emerge. And they were very articulate, you know.
Of course, and you get those groups like Lundi.am, who basically, I don't know, they are post-autonomists. They were like the Invisible Committee, those sorts of people. They're into communisation theory. So you get some quite erudite people around it. So like, we can create that protest against the airport, which is name I can't remember now. So at a local level, they can organise quite well. Yeah, they can organise quite well. They can create these things. And obviously now we have the internet, that helps a lot. But to scale it up, you know, you can create, you know, you have an occupation, you can run it.
They got them on TV, they got interviewed, they had a lot of ideas, and these people were, I mean, they were only workers, it was not particularly trained or anything, or studied, but they had good ideas, good general ideas of what to do.
Yeah, but they've had
and then they were trying to incorporate them into parties, and people just wouldn't do it. But of course, it's sort of faded, you know, as the movement's faded, and they've
been involved in the Labour Party for a very long time. So, you know, I've seen it twice in my lifetime now. You know, in the early 1980s, we had this huge upsurge, the so-called Benite movement. I'm not that great a fan of Tony Benn, but he certainly was the front man. But he was anti-European, which I always thought was very dodgy. There was that, you know, around the GLC, which is what I was involved with. And then now the whole Corbyn phenomenon. There's a tension between that. You know, how do you, on the one hand, you do need to institutionalise. And part of the problem, I think, you know, happened the last 5 years, is they didn't actually focus on really changing the Labour Party. It stayed a very bureaucratic structure. And that's that's one of the reasons we lost the 2017 election, actually, because the bureaucracy was not working again, as we discovered. The HQ didn't want to win, you know, and we can see now, you know, there's this reassert, and it's the iron law of oligarchy. Robert Michels was a Luxembourg, you know, was a follower of Rosa Luxemburg and believed in spontaneity and participation, and then got incredibly cynical and ended up as a fascist in Italy, where only the charismatic leader could overcome the bureaucracy. And certainly the Labour Party, you know, they have this, you know, both at the local level, at the level of the MPs, of the party machinery, it tends to bureaucratise. And we saw, you can see this in the French Revolution. It gets more and more radical, and then at some point it stops, and then it goes back the other way. And so you end up back at Bonaparte, and then you have another revolution, and that fucks up, and then you have another revolution, that fucks up, you have a third revolution. Okay, it doesn't fuck up quite as badly, and you end up with the Republic, but it's not quite what you meant in 1792, even if it has all the iconography and all the basic demands are being met, because what it meant in 1792 and what it means in 1889 are two different things, actually.
With that historical process of revolution and then just kind of history moving in the way you've just described, and you're talking about your involvement in the Labour Party, like just to try and get your insight on something that's incredibly contemporary, like what do you think of this current sort of Blairite coup of the Labour Party, this kind of Starmer sort of purging, this sort of Stalinist purging of Long Bailey, etc. Is this a sign that all those revolutionary movements that you've just talked about are currently impossible, and the only thing that we have kind of going forward is neoliberal kind of just arbitrary, fucking around with minor details?
I actually knew Keir Starmer when he was a Pabloist.
What is a Pabloist?
Michel Raptis. He was the leader of the Trotskyist Fourth International in the 1950s.
He's Trot, right.
And then he got involved in the Algerian Revolution, worked with Ben Bella, split with Trotskyism. And so in the 1980s, I said I was in France in the 1980s because my partner was living there for a year, and we met people from this group called the International, I can't remember, basically it's the International Marxist Revolutionary Tendency, and they were not Trotskyists, they were not a vanguard party. They absolutely insisted they weren't they probably were a vanguard party, but so they had probably about 500, 1,000 members. They were like red-green, so they were like, some of them were in the Green Party and some of them were in the Socialist Party, and that's what really screwed them up, because they could never make up their mind whether they were Greens among Reds or Reds among Greens. But they were really good. Pablo had been banging on about ecology, and in Europe is third wave feminism, because obviously the French Revolution is the first wave, and then there's the second wave in the late 19th, early 20th century, and then so they were very much into that, and then of course, and self-management. So that was the key thing. It's all, his involvement with Ben Bella in the Algerian Revolution. Ben Bella tried to do a lot of this before he got overthrown. I respect them a lot because they had this critique of why Mitterrand failed. And obviously the Labour left at the time were completely enamoured with the common programme and the alternative economic strategy here. And it's Lexit. It's basically Lexit, actually, in much more favourable circumstances. And they understood, as I said earlier, why it didn't work. They were one of those people who understood why it didn't work. They were very pro-European, actually. They say, well, it's only going to work if we get all the Western Europe, then to get all the Western European lefts to work together. They were good. And he did this magazine here called Socialist Alternatives. You can find it actually online. Pabloist. You look up British Pabloism.wordpress, I think it is. So in 1987, I wrote an article about a Red in the Green Party called Alan Lippius called them. And he was then very hard left. He was the organiser. There was another guy who was like a front guy who was really good. I think he was French. He now lives in Quebec, a guy called Benji. And Keir was the guy who actually got it all done, made sure all the articles were in and went to the printers on time. And so he was very well organised. And he was then defending people, trade unionists who'd been arrested at Wapping when the police were attacking pickets. I was there for Wapping, so that was very respectful. So then he was in very radical left. And I haven't really had any contact with him since then. I'm bemused when he keeps turning up looking, as you said, like a sort of, he's more soft left. He's more, I don't think he is a Blairite. I think that's a misunderstanding. He's Ed Miliband, who's one of his best friends. So he's a little Ed Miliband. He wants to be Prime Minister, so he's pretty fucking ruthless, I think.
Maybe not a Blairite then, but I think the thing that stands out in my mind is his sort of undermining of the BLM movement recently and saying this is not an overarching...
He didn't undermine it. He was just like, really didn't understand it, I think.
But is that not the same thing? I mean, when you have that kind of position of power, can you just excuse it as not understanding?
Right? No, but what I find amazing is that the Keir of 40 years ago would have understood it, because he would have been taught by, 30 years ago, because of the whole GLC experience here, the because anti-fascism, like Touche pas mon pot and all that stuff that was going on in France was really strong. I mean, it's not like Black Lives Matter is something new. It's on a much greater intensity, but, certainly in France, okay, lots of them weren't very radical, nor the Black Lives Matter. Lots of them were involved with the Clintons and Ford Foundation. Certainly that sort of politics he would have understood because of what was going on in France and here. So I just thought it was incredibly cloth-eared, if nothing else.
Right.
Yes, to be respectable. And he doesn't have, it's interesting, people like Dawn Butler, who are not that radical. I mean, she's a very good MP. Why isn't she in the front row of the shadow cabinet? she's got some minor position. And that's where I think he reminds me of Ed. He's like too desperate to be respectable. I don't.
Right. Yeah.
He's part of the establishment because he was director of public prosecution. And someone said he's actually been inducted into the Trilateral Commission. So I guess all conspiracy theorists go.
I mean, it's just insane. I mean, it's insane to me. I think what you said about him being kind of tone deaf there makes sense. However, I mean, he went on national television and essentially said that the BLM movement is a moment in time, and then said, "Oh, it's absolutely insane about kind of reviewing police practice or looking at funding of police practice." When the statistics show, like objectively, that there are still huge issues with race and criminalisation in the UK.
He should know because he was, as I said, I met him. He was defending trade unions at Wapping. They'd been attacked. I mean, I was there during the police riot. It was one of my near-death experiences of life. Was going to be in the Peterloo massacre with one of me as the victim. So he knows that. He was involved in the McLibel case. He was in story, the Steve Lawrence, where the police were bought off by the local gangster and they were racists anyway. This sort of thing. So so wonderful.
He knows it. So what are his reasons for allying himself with both?
Because they're desperate to show the establishment that they're okay.
Right.
He's not like Blair. Blair really believed all that neoliberal bullshit.
Did you just say that the HQ didn't want Corbyn to win? Did you say that? The Labour HQ?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
They were Blairites.
So what did they do? They sabotaged it then, the election?
There was a leaked report, which is extraordinary. I mean, also, all this racist abuse against Diane is just and other black MPs is just absolutely disgusting. But they go on about
Right. That's the big irony, right?
The really disgusting thing is the hatred of black and Asian people, and that's been completely covered up. So there's also that. It's also to do with that the right-wing Labour Party don't like black people in a really fundamental way. They're afraid of them. Actually, because
it's becoming like National Socialism or something.
Well, that's actually on the. It's all that National Bolshevism. Actually, it's called National Bolshevism.
National Socialism without the socialism.
Yeah.
But also, I don't.
In France, it happened as well. In the 1920s and 30s, there is this sort of left fascism. And I know it seems weird to us. I mean, you have to understand Mussolini came from the hard left.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And again, it's what we were talking about earlier on. I mean, it's pity Zara's disappeared now, but what she said was correct. There is this part of nationalism, even left nationalism. It can seem like that. The Lexiters, the Lexit people, they are very close to fascism, some of them. But it's also on the right, the Blairite right of the same. It's part of, again, it comes back to why should we think about the state as the left? It's because they have this very instrumentalist view of the state. There were people in Lotto, the leadership office, who basically thought that the Labour get elected and they just move into the levers of power. They just take over the civil service as a thin layer and they just manoeuvre the state as if it's levers, they just press. Right. See the state as a social relationship. I mean, they claim to be read Marx, but they obviously fucking haven't. They don't. We used to really like this book in the 1980s called In and Against the State. The state is a social relationship. So that's why you have to be in the Labour Party. That's why you need to take state power. But you have to understand what you're doing in that. That you're not, it's not like paint the British state red and then everything's okay.
I think there's this massive conservative sort of rhetoric around now, which basically says, if you go far left enough, if you actually sort of begin to actualize the theory of Marxism, etc., then you become fascist, right? I don't think that's true. I don't think there is this figure eight thing where you just go round and round in a sort of circuit of unbroken ideology. I think there is a break in which something fundamentally happens, which
Lexiters are on the right.
I've always said
I tried to point this out. They claim to be left, but it's a right.
Okay.
It's a right.
Some of the laziest reasoning I've continually hear.
People.
I would have noticed over the last
sorry, I can't hear you, Colin.
6 months or so.
We can't hear you.
Completely dropped the facade.
Yeah.
I have seen supposed anti-racist centrist types just viciously attacking, as Richard was alluding to a little while ago, of black people, particularly black women in the Labour Party, being viciously smeared, viciously attacked. Subject to naked racial abuse, which was revealed in that report, and then for talking about it, these sensible, moderate anti-racists with no material grounding to their putative anti-racism, accusing them of being the real anti-Semites, the real racists for
both the right and the left,
the racist abuse that have been subjected to. And over the last few days, there's actually been a really weird
Well, you get both Blairites and Corbynistas who do this. So it's not just one faction.
Doesn't that negate the whole this sacredness of the Labour Party and imply that perhaps we need to sort of blow that shit up and fucking move on? Because at the point, there seems to be a point where it's just going around in circles of...
You set up another party and it will turn into exactly the same thing.
Is that what you think?
It's an objective sociological condition. In that sense, this is what Robert Michel's got correct. I mean, there's lots of wrong things about his book. The iron law of oligarchy, which he obviously makes into a trans-historical principle, but there's something about that. I mean, if you created another left party, it will go through the same sort of problems. Okay, if they kick me out of the Labour Party, I'd go and do something else, but there seems a little point of going through the whole process again just to end up where you started off. If you look at France, since we're talking about, they set up this party called France Insoumise, which was like a left of the Socialist Party, and it's run by this guy Jean-Luc Mélenchon, comes out of Trotskyism, in many ways very charismatic, had lots of good ideas, great speaker. It ended up as a sort of one-man band. He actually famously, when there was some police raid on him for some reason, he said, La République, c'est moi. Well, I know, I had a friend in France who voted for him, but, so those sort of structural problems strike me as that something, if you enter the electoral sphere, you will end up like that. And so it seems fetishising whether you're inside or outside the Labour Party. Seems a bit of a...
You could think of the Labour Party as almost like trolls against change, so they're there to make it look like there's somebody on the side of the people, but they're not really.
No, it's our party, but it's a site of struggle.
I don't know, Richard. I think there's a point to be made here where it seems to be that the Labour Party is in either the hands of domineering sort of neoliberal kind of shadow cabinet, or it's. I mean, the one time I've seen it in my lifetime is with Corbyn and stuff, and that the opinion seemed to be that Corbyn was so disliked widely that he was untenable, which was a complete paradox, because if you speak, you say somebody's unelectable enough in the popular media, then obviously they're unelectable. I mean, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But
that's a different question, because we came very close to winning in 2017, and then
true, yeah,
and in 2019 we didn't. So that's a completely different. The question is here. We're talking about the French Revolution and republicanism.
Sure.
Is if you're going to participate in the Democratic Republic as the left, you're going to end up with a parliamentary party, whether you like it or not. That means it's going to start to take on these bureaucratic structures, and you're going to have these arguments. And if you look at the history of Labour, it had the Fabian Society, who were social imperialists. They were pro-British Empire. They supported the Boer War. This sort of thing. So and they were a very strong force. And they were also Marxists. So it was all, it was just, certainly before 1914. I live in East London. Our MP was Keir Hardie. So, you had people like him who were sort of Christian Marxists, whatever that means. You have a whole hodgepodge of different people. You have people who are the Engels fan club, basically, Friedrich Engels' group, and other people. You have this whole wide variety of people. So, it got very, very bureaucratized, I think.
Can I ask you one question which essentially sums up and cuts through my absolute fucking up of the point that I was trying to make? But do you think there's the space for a party or a representative group, perhaps even pre-party here, that has a slightly more consistent ideology, a slightly more consistent leftism than the Labour Party currently exhibits? Because Labour's leftism seems to be so utterly paradoxical between the different wings of Labour. Is there a way to concentrate?
I was involved with some people who've just helped put together the forward momentum list and swept the national coordinating group. So I like momentum should do that. So because it's inside the party, in my view. And that's just my personal... I come out of the 1980s. I saw all these friends of mine who were like SWP and anarchist groups and whatever. And, on one level, the SWP did great stuff against the National Front in the 1970s. So they can do... I've known anarchists who, I did pirate radio with anarchists. Or, they did things like Stop the City and, Occupy. So I'm not going to diss these groups. But I'm just saying, if you're serious about intervening in the state, you're going to end up with something like the Labour. Partly because in England, we're talking about England, where we have a first past the post system. So it's basically a two-party system, except in Scotland, where it's a one-party and disunited unionists, luckily. But in England, which is what we're really talking about here, it's a two-party system, and you're either in one party or the other. And the Liberal Democrats serve to help keep the Tories in power. That's their basic function in life. That means that's there. If you change the electoral system, maybe not with a coalition of political parties.
So how do you go about changing that electoral?
But it have to be a Labour government that does it. You see, that's one of the reasons.
Do you genuinely think that? Because because surely at the point when a Labour government takes power and establishes control over the Commons, that's the exact time when they wouldn't want to essentially push forward any kind of electoral reform, because it would be counterintuitive to their own.
Exactly. I agree with you. It was one of the few good things the Blairites used to say, because they were all Euro-communists at that point. We all tend to forget that. They were great Stuart Hall fans and all that, you know. They would always go on about one thing we're going to do is introduce proportional representation, because basically they wanted to ally with the Lib Dem to isolate the left. But as soon as they got a sweeping great majority, they forgot that one really quickly. At least they did devolution, and at least they made peace with the IRA. Actually, that was probably their major achievement, actually. That's, you know, so that it just seems to me that it might well come, though, because we're heading towards a constitutional crisis in this country because of Brexit. The interesting thing is the United Kingdom Independence Party will have successfully destroyed the United Kingdom. And England is the last colony of the British Empire. You know, we'll have to do something about our imperial constitution.
On a night which we're talking about on Bastille Day and talking about French revolutionary politics, is there a way that we can imagine any sort of revolutionary act outside of electoralism?
Buckingham Palace, chop the Queen's head off.
Well, you know, I've been trying for years and it's not really quite gone to plan.
Wasn't that Ian Bone or something?
Yeah, the guy who broke in and got caught under a bed or something comical.
No. Ian Bone.
Slapstick.
Ian
Was that
Bone.
someone else?
No, he ran class war. I think they were.
Oh, okay.
They did some anti-monarchist activity.
I see.
But they had like a mocked-up guillotine. It was interesting that they chose the guillotine as a symbol and not an axe, given that they'd actually done it 150 years earlier than the French. But I guess the guillotine is a more iconic image.
It is iconic. I was thinking about starting up a guillotine sales business off the back of the whole BLM sort of fervor, etc. I was hoping it would spread and lead to like complete fucking leftist revolutionary fervor, and you know I could really make a profit.
I mean, as I said,
as a capitalist, you know, as a good old capitalist.
But I think, you know, as I said, come back to Bastille Day. I mean, that's, you know, celebrating revolutions, even if they're bourgeois revolutions. And to be honest, I basically think all revolutions so far have been bourgeois revolutions in their different forms. Is good because it actually gives people confidence that you can make radical social change. How you do it in the 21st century in an advanced capitalist country is really interesting. Because there was, you know, the May 68 revolution, we forget that, is how close they came to really toppling the Fifth Republic. De Gaulle ran away to West Germany to get the French army to promise to come and use tanks again. The way he won was actually not using the tanks like Brezhnev did in Czechoslovakia, but calling an election. And he said, well, you want state power, you have a choice, me or the Stalinist party. And at that point, he won.
In retrospect.
I mean, he left power a year later. But it's interesting that because the new left said elections are treason. You know, we want workers' councils or we just want Occupy or whatever. But they actually, when it came, if someone said, right, here, you've got a choice, you can take state power, they went, oh shit. They didn't have the governance, as we talked about later, to be able to do that. And the only party that could have replaced the Gaullists in 1968 was the French Stalinist party, and they didn't want to because the Treaty of Yalta, France had been given to the West.
And weren't the French Stalinist party at the time incredibly disliked?
They got 20% of the vote. They would have won in 1945 election. They would have won a near majority if they hadn't given women the vote, because women got the vote for the first time in 1945. If it only voted, they would have become the government. They led the resistance. And like I said, like the Italian Communist Party. You know, the thing is that they weren't going to take power because of the Cold War. And they agreed, you know, so they drew a line. You know, you can go down to the Churchill bunker. You can see where Churchill, as the representative of Roosevelt and Stalin, they drew a line through Europe and they said the East bit goes to Russia and the West bit goes to America. And they were in the American zone, so they weren't going to take power. It's as simple as that. So there wasn't really a choice. So De Gaulle got it, you know. Brezhnev was cruder. He had to send the tanks in to get rid of the dissident communists who were running in Czechoslovakia. Or Stalinists, reformed Stalinists, or whatever Dubček was. So that's the thing. We won in 2017. That would have been interesting. So I thought you can do things with state power as long as you realise what you're doing, what the limitations are.
It feels strange from a voter's standpoint, voting for a party that you're ideologically completely counter to, just because of the name of the party, if that makes sense, because of the current makeup of the shadow cabinet and the ideology that's kind of feeding their manifestos. You know what I mean? Like that's what I mean by consistent. Being a Labour voter, which I haven't been, but you know, under Corbyn, certainly was, you know.
Yeah, but I just don't think it's. I mean, I voted for Blair.
Right. Say no more.
I stayed a member during Blair and Brown, but partly because Jeremy and John and Diane stayed in. So I thought, right, fuck it. As long as they're in, I'm staying in.
You thought at least you have some sort of representation, even if
Well,
they're relatively minor figures.
But also because of my historical view, I thought sooner or later it will swing back to the left. And it did, you know, in 2015, I think it's much to our surprise, Jeremy won. I went to a meeting where it was discussed about whether we should run a left candidate in 2015. And Owen Jones said, no, we're going to get hammered. And we should do a Not the Labour Leadership tour, obviously starring Owen Jones. And I could see what his point was, but we all said, no, we've got to show that at least there's still a left in the Labour Party. And then Jeremy won, much to our surprise, and Jeremy's surprise. But it shows if he hit the zeitgeist. And if we hadn't stayed in, he would have never got elected. So it just seems to me, people, when these millennials like you, are you a millennial? Are you?
I think I might be, yeah. Right. Well, the interesting thing about this whole kind of millennial and now the Generation Z, apparently the Zoomers are reading a lot of theory and they're very radicalized because they've seen that millennials essentially fail to manifest any sort of leftist actual change, and therefore they're far more fucking Maoist, they're far more Leninist.
That's what happened after 68. There was a brief flourishing of Trotskyism in this country. And in France, it was Maoism.
Right. I think it's the jobs of the millennials now to rally behind these Zoomers if they're going to actually try and achieve something quite tangible.
Years' time, they're probably all social liberals. What these small groups do is prepare you to become a Labour MP. Keir, Keir, hard left Pabloist. Look up British Pabloism.wordpress. He obviously prepared him for his glittering career.
But my political kind of, I suppose, awakening has kind of gone in reverse. It's gone from kind of like old school British liberalism quite rapidly to almost hardline communism because of just being so disillusioned with what any kind of electoralism can actually make happen. It almost seems like
we had illusions. You see, my problem is I think you had illusions of electoralism.
Perhaps, yeah.
1976, I saw the Sex Pistols, read Society's Spectacle, and took acid. So
great combo.
So I've never had illusions in electoralism. I learned, because I didn't vote in 1979. I remember this friend of mine saying, no, they had this Labour government, which was very right-wing. My father was right-wing Labour, and he loved them. And they used troops to break a firefighter strike. And so when I was at university, and we used to go along and show solidarity to the Cambridge firefighters and hang out with them because they were great guys. And so I didn't vote. And I remember this guy giving me this long fucking lecture about how, no, you've got to stay disciplined and go and vote Labour. Because if the Tories get in, it'll be a lot worse. And I go, no, they can't possibly be worse. And I remember going back to him 6 months later and say, you were right, I was wrong. And I joined the Labour Party and I refused to leave. They tried to throw me out for coordinating Jeremy's Digital Democracy Manifesto in 2016. We beat them. So
I think it's kind of interesting about that decision because I had the same movement. I mean, I voted Green when I could, and then eventually I went, oh shit, okay. I voted begrudgingly for Miliband, and then I vote very enthusiastically for Corbyn. But no, I think that joining of the Labour Party and sort of throwing your eggs in that basket implies both this sort of positive sort of utopianism-ish, where you're kind of like, this can happen, this can really lead to real social change, and it's also this sort of negative movement where you're like, wow, it's not quite what I want right now. Do you know what I mean? It's a very bipolar fucking position to take.
Well, Max, if you read Marx, the Labour Party was set up by his daughter, and Engels writes letters complaining that the English Anglo-Saxon sectarians who can't get it together to all get it to form one class party.
Right.
Obsessed with ideology.
Was that a wrong point?
It was Marx's daughter.
Yeah.
He set up the Independent Labour Party, which basically became the Labour Party eventually. And so they actually were really, that's why it says in the Communist Manifesto that communists don't form parties of their own. They thought everybody should be in one party, including mad Christians and whatever, They just thought they were really against Bolshevism. That's because they were around. Jacobinism was around, this idea that there's that famous quote that Marx says, the one thing I'm sure is I'm not a Marxist. And what he means is he didn't want ideology parties. He didn't like them. He thought that was the key thing. If you're going to win elections, you want to have as many people voting from the cloth. Right. What he didn't like is alliances with the bourgeoisie. So he said you should have a mass class party with all sorts of political ideologies in it, but it should never, ever ally with the bourgeoisie. And that's been the trouble in the 20th century, is they've always ended up, the Social Democrats, they end up in a popular front. They have to, because fascism is the alternative.
Right.
Right themselves become, the left become the bourgeoisie.
And so you've seen this exact same situation. It's not a Marxist position, but it's not too far off with, for example, a figure like Chomsky, you know, who's kind of theorized anarcho-syndicalism, etc., and is now saying vote for Joe Biden because the alternative is Trump and neo-fascism, etc.
But he also supported Slobodan Milosevic, dodgy people like that.
Maybe that's a poor parallel then.
I'm not too sure that he's a very good...
He's sort of been like sent to the naughty corner by the left recently, hasn't he, Chomsky?
The other difficulty is I'm not sure the Democratic Party isn't a social democratic party. People have tried to change it, but it's not really a political party. You can't be a member of the Democratic Party in the same way you can be a member of the Labour Party. It's not like a member party which has a bureaucracy on it. It's more like an 18th, early 19th century English. It's more like the Whigs and the Tories. You have local oligarchs who run an electoral campaign. If you talk to people in the DSA, I mean, not the woke end of them, but the ones who are actually involved in proper politics, they say this is the problem. There is no, it's not like the Labour Party where you could vote in a leader. You can't even take over, the state of California's Democratic Party because it doesn't really exist. It's just like a network of electoralism. So it's not a party in the European sense. I says it's much more like Whigs and Tories were. But in Europe, certainly since formation of the Liberal and Conservative parties here after the 1867 Reform Act, we started to get these mass member parties. And the Socialist parties were based on them. The mass party is an electoral machine. That's really what it is. And then it becomes a social thing. I have a friend, Max Shanney, who hammered on and on about this. And I think a lot of people now respect that he was right. And the people were just doing too much. They didn't really focus. It's party education. One of the things the Labour Party should be doing is educating its members. If you go to party conference, certainly the last, since Jeremy got there, party conference got brilliant. World transformed, and it just becomes socially, it just became immensely better, and it was a great networking event. So those sorts of sides of it were really important, and it was all allowed to wither, and it got worse and worse and worse. And then Blair just turned it into a sort of management thing. I mean, I went to some of his Blairite events, and it was just like going to a corporate law. It's interesting that they completely turned the membership into passive members, because what they didn't realise is that given a chance to vote for a hard left after 2 election defeats, they chose Jeremy. At the moment, it seems like we've gone back to Ed Miliband. No, I don't agree with it. A friend of mine said that Ed intellectually broke with Blairism, but he couldn't emotionally break with it.
That's interesting. That's a great way to put it.
I think that's a lot to do with Keir, because Keir, I'm sure, bought into the whole Blairite thing at some point as he ascended his legal career from the hard left. That's why it strikes me that his missteps. He's obviously desperate to shut down the Israeli embassy, and his missteps, as he said, over Black Lives. That silly thing where they were kneeling as well in their office, which is
right.
I mean, it was also very Ed Miliband, because Ed's tried to do it, and then he would oscillate in the other direction and have immigration month, as the corporate people in Southside were telling him to do something different. And that's what my fear is, that they're going to they're soft left. That's the difficulty, which means that they lack any spine. You need to think about that. It's a different question. I mean, but if you're a Republican, you have to participate in the Republic, and that means political parties, and it has to be a serious political party. And you can do the other stuff. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, I'm not dissing it, but I'm just saying if it's part of the struggle is, I'm afraid, being in the Labour Party. And if you're in Spain and you fall for Demos, you end up sooner or later in alliance with the Socialist Party, because that's what it means.
Right.
And it's the same with France Insoumise. It didn't replace the Socialist Party, and now it's part of a coalition with the Greens and the Socialists and the Stalinists, and the left just done very well in the local elections. I mean, it's taken places like Marseille, which I haven't been there for years, but I remember friends, it's incredibly corrupt right-wing establishment there. And by getting the left getting its act together and stop fighting each other, they just took over Marseille, which is it's one of the best places in France. The national anthem is named after it.
Yeah.
Full of North Africans and Maghrebians. I haven't been there, but it has fantastic nightclubs. Terrible. It was run by people who are essentially in bed with the mafia. That was because the left finally got its act together, and they all got together. Greens, Socialists, Stalinists, Trotskyists, they all got
right.
So my view is, I haven't really spoken to Keir in 30 years, is this man is really smart. He must think, I'm going to be Prime Minister within 18 months. Yeah, because the Tories are heading towards the cliff at a huge rate. Promise something they can't deliver. Mitterrand couldn't get out of the EU. They certainly can't. We're even more integrated. So they can't actually leave the EU, and yet they've riled up an entire base of gammons who want to do it. It's either chaos or implosion. He must think that if he just looks like more or less a sensible centre leftist, that the British establishment will accept. They were terrified of Jeremy. I mean, God knows why. I think the manifestos were really good. I mean, partly because a couple of things from our Digital Democracy Manifesto got in them. And obviously the GLC model terrified them because they thought, well, if Labour gets in, it will carry on going left. So normally Labour gets in a left manifesto and then moves rightwards. But this is ex-GLC and they know what to do is to get in and then keep moving left, because that's the way you stay in power. And I was told this by a Reuters journalist that half the city were terrified of the Harbrecht and half the city were terrified of John MacDonald as Chancellor of the Exchequer. The British establishment just monstered us. The BBC gave up any objectivity. I have a friend who's convinced they were ballot stuffing in the north of England, absolutely convinced they were using postal votes illegally. They didn't want to see it. If you're someone like Keir Starmer, he's just saying, well, don't look frightening. Don't annoy the Israelis. Don't look like you're a scary black person, and you'll be Prime Minister. And you can do mildly good things. That would be my he's a soft left. I mean, he might turn into Blair, but at the moment, if he's Ed Miliband, he's soft left. And that was Ed. As I said, I don't think Ed's a bad person, actually. He's smart. It's his brother I don't trust. I always like Ed Miliband because he stopped his brother becoming Labour leader. In that election, we had 4 choices, and I put his brother bottom, Diane top, and then just worked out who I was going to vote for number 2, because Diane obviously wasn't going to get it at that time. He's the smartest, and he's soft left. And I thought he wouldn't be hard and iron enough on the Blairites. He was too in hot with them. That's maybe the problem with Keir, is he comes out of that group. We'll see what happens. I mean, I agree with you. You say you went to this Brighton one. In 1992, I went to the victory celebration when Glenda Jackson took Hampstead and Highgate. We were in the Camden Palace, and it was like this brilliant victory celebration because we took it. I first really got to know John because John was when he was deputy leader of GLC, he was the candidate in Ham and High. So I did lots of canvassing in 1983 for him. But we finally took it in 19. So we actually had this thing where we all thought we'd won the election as well because we'd taken Ham and High, and we must have won. Bloody Kinnock had blown it because the guy. But we had a candidate, of course, that lots of middle-aged men had seen naked in the cinema, and were determined to vote for it. She was a very good candidate. I will say, actually, she was a very good candidate. It's a pity she never became our art spokesperson, but anyway, that's another story. And I always thought that someone like Kinnock was a bit thick. That was his problem. Say to on the doorstep, he's not very intelligent, is he? I think it's good that you picked up on the black. I think he showed that he just didn't get it in a really fundamental way.
Which is strange, coming from a historically left party and seeing an incredibly valid, historically left movement and not being able to kind of identify the
Jeremy Corbyn, why that they thought they can't do it. If it was Jeremy would have probably helping them pull a few statues over, wouldn't he?
Well, you'd think so, but then Corbyn's, like, at least in my lifetime, witnessing him, his kind of radicalism's always been sort of something alluded to, something I've never witnessed. I've only ever witnessed his apologia surrounding his previous radicalism. I've never actually witnessed said radicalism.
Given how weak we were within the Labour Party, I think we did pretty well. And those two
kind of hiding it, sneaking it in.
Well, the 2 manifestos are very good. They'll stand the test of time.
Sure.
And it has pushed the party quite a lot to the left. There's going to be a layer of new activists, people who have got elected as MPs. The left is in a much stronger position. You're right. I mean, people like you have probably gone through a period of disillusion. I mean, this woman I was talking about who was very involved in the GLC, who spent the year in Paris, she had a nervous breakdown because a lot of people, they were just so devastated by Thatcher basically consolidating neoliberalism. As I said, I'm trained as a historian, Marx only wrote Capital because between the 1848 revolution and 1870, he had to do something useful. That's, otherwise he'd have just written pamphlets, he'd have never written his masterwork. And anyway, he never got around to finishing that, did he? Because he got distracted by the Paris Commune. Marx was someone who needed a word processor.
Do you think, Richard, there's a leftist theorist who, within our current paradigm, is most essential to read for somebody who wants to get clued up in relevant leftist theory?
Well, apart from me, you mean?
well, I mean, that would be very narcissistic, Richard.
I know, I'm just teasing it. I think, for the Labour Party, there's a really good book that was about to be published in August 1914, and then the war started, and the guy came from Galicia. He was a Polish Jew, but he's German. It's called Max Beer, A History of British Socialism.
Okay, cool.
Pick it up quite cheaply online. He did a sort of a supplement afterwards to the 20s and 30s, but the key thing is actually up to 1914. He eventually ended up in the German Communist Party, I think, at some point. So the German Social Democrats, they were exiled here at various times. So Kautsky, Bernstein. So there was a very close link between the Labour Party, the German Social Democrats, which people tend to forget. They got us into the International in 1908 and that sort of thing. And then obviously the International First International was founded in London, and Engels was living here. And so he was the correspondent of the German Social Democratic newspaper, Vorwärts, Forward. And he wrote this history for them. And it's very much a sort of double reflection between the two. So he's talking about Britain, but he's also talking about, and he sort of says, that basically that Karl Marx is the German theorist of English Chartism. Essentially, one of his arguments is. Looking at it now, I would think that's a good place to start. I think because we've gone through the 20th century, we're 100 years after the Russian Revolution, in a way that really just mislead the West European left in a really profound way. And it sort of scrambled us a bit. And I think that's one of our problems. It's been very difficult to overcome that misunderstanding of what happened in the East, that it was the French Revolution. It really was it was a bourgeois revolution, that we didn't need to copy it, because actually Leon Blum got up at the Congress of Tours when the French Socialist Party split and most of it joined the Third International. He stayed as a Second International, and he got up and said, the revolution you want to happen in France has already happened, which I think was a genius. And then he ends up later as the leader of the Popular Front. And he also wrote this interesting about what he called the difference between the exercise of power and the conquest of, so a bit like England against the state, actually. And he said because they had to sort of rationalise the Socialist Party coming to power without it having a majority. And that's always been the problem, So the way, I was saying with my PhD group, there was this guy, Phil Slater, and he's English, but he was very involved with the extra-parliamentary left, Germany. And he said the big mistake of his generation is that they translated all this, Lukács and all these Bolshevik, so-called Western mark. He said what we didn't translate was, because it was the 1980s when the Labour Party was a left faith, is what we didn't translate was all the Social Democrats and Austro-Marxists.
Right. He
said because actually Lukács is interesting because he was trained as a philosopher. But he did a book on the Frankfurt School, but he said they've got nothing to tell us. He was in Hornsey CLP, and he said he doesn't really tell us anything of how Hornsey Council should operate. He ends up then with the Euro-communists. It's one of the reasons the Euro-communists were able to take over the Labour Party and basically put Blair into power.
But I don't know too much about Lukács, but from one thing I've ascertained from my reading, and I could be wrong here, Lukács seems to be one of these sort of post-Marx Marxists who rejected so many of the insights gleaned by modernism and become this kind of like complete traditionalist who...
No, that's later. That was his Stalinist phase. He became a very defender of socialist realism, as it was called later. So he wrote this book called History of Class Consciousness, which the Bohr is one of the things in Society of the Spectre, but it's a bit like Bordiger. It's a very elitist Bolshevik text. Basically, all the working class are stupid, they're stuck in false consciousness, and but the revolutionary intellectuals, because they have the correct philosophy.
Oh, yeah, got you, yeah.
Yeah, and that's, again, very influential. And you'll see this now. The generation who are now disillusioned with the Labour Party, as you say, are now writing about, I call them the mythic Bolsheviks. So someone said they're Twitter tankies, which I thought was a really nice name for them. Interesting, they're Bolsheviks without vanguards. They're great at making memes, but they don't actually have an organisation. Or they have websites of parties of 3. You can now do that. It would be really difficult to produce a newspaper. You need to have at least 50 or 60 people in your group, but now you can do it with 3 or 4. Have you come across this intergalactical Posadist League?
Well, I've heard of Posadism. It's a new league.
There's a meme out, and then this Russian guy lives in New York, and it's called the Intergalactical Workers League Posadists or something. And he's actually written some really great things about, because in Class War Games, he said that, all these groups are historical reenactment society, and he also thinks that. So he says first time as tragedy, second time as farce, third time as LARPing. It's exactly what we said in Class War Games. That's right. Why form a Trotskyist group? You can play Trotsky with a 28mm figure. A friend of ours makes them, and he'll sell you a Trotsky, and you play war games with Trotsky, because that's all you're doing. I'm sure that's going to happen. The other term will be some revival of Occupy type horizontalism, won't it? You go back to, hopefully that leads to community activism and co-ops and things like that. So that's always good.
Does it show the fragility of historical terms being just revised and stuff, and the need for perhaps these new, even though they might seem farcical at the time, terms to determine your political ideology and your allegiance?
But what you're talking about earlier on about dressing yourself up, because actually they're not really Bolshevik. As I said, they're in the age of social media. I haven't got to that. I've done the first draft. of this section, but I haven't got to the second draft yet. So that was the point I was making. There's like real Bolshevism, which is rounding up large numbers of workers and shooting them, among other things. I mean, there's other things to it, but I'm well trained by Guy Debord to think that it's Kronstadt. But then there's a sort of later version, which is, how do you form up after May 68? There's lots of sort of small groups, and there's something about Bolshevism, Jacobinism, as it was called in the 19th century, that allows you to organise 3,000 or 4,000 people. You have a very strict ideology, usually a male charismatic leader.
So it's the formal aspects rather than any kind of
who
concept.
often wants to sexually abuse people. But that allows you to keep a group together for at least for a period of time. And what amazed me is, I'm the generation, so I remember the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I thought they'd all disappear. I thought, oh, this is good, it'll get rid of Trotskyism, if nothing else. First, we're not going to be afraid of dying in a nuclear war by accident, and the second thing, it'll get rid of Trotskyism. And then, of course, it had no effect on them whatsoever.
If anything, it seemed to actually antagonise and proliferate
all their theories
Trotskyism.
about what was going to happen in Eastern Europe were proved incorrect, and they didn't even notice.
Right.
It was completely different from what they claimed was going to happen. But they didn't know. Then I realised it was to do with the psychology of small groups. It was actually, how do you organise a few thousand people round an ideology party, as they were called in the 19th century. But now you don't even need to do that. You don't even need to do a few thousand people. All you need is a few people, a website, a Twitter account, a Facebook page.
I'm starting to think about this in a piece I want to write about, essentially like the pace of the new media, the YouTube media, the meme media, the 30-second video clip media, in which you can essentially witness like the most grotesque and unimaginable thing that you would never have seen in a previous lifetime, but you now can.
Publish it, Max, and then I can cite you as a...
What I was thinking is, rather than just be subjugated by it, and because the right use this kind of fast-paced media incredibly effective to essentially spread ideology.
They learn from us.
Well, yeah, true, but I mean, the idea that we can kind of completely ignore this idea of any kind of transcendental truth and come up with all these affective, capital A videos which kind of encourage some sort of solidarity or social unison seems like a complete possibility within the new sort of media-fed left, and yet it seems like we still kind of cling to this moral high ground, high horse kind of thing. Where it's sometimes fighting Trump on Trump grounds, etc., might be actually the effective way of doing it.
So after the 2017 election, we were invited to give a presentation to the SPD in Berlin, who were elected to the CDU. And this guy was basically, I can probably remember what his fucking name is. He was like the secretary, sort of Blairite of Apparatus. They had this very nice headquarters with pictures of Marx and Kautsky, and then more right-wingers they got as it progressed further. We showed them, because we'd done Corbyn Run, we did 1.5 million impressions, and so we told them all about the left media here. And then we started showing them Grand Marshal Corbyn's meme factory, or whatever it was, which is some guy who was just taking all this Stalinist and Maoist imagery and putting John and Jeremy's head on it and making a funny slogan. And they just couldn't get it. They were so soft left, or even Blairite. And I said, well, that's how you appeal to voters. I said, you've got to understand that it's a joke. We're English, and the English, the Gammons don't get it, but the Gammons don't like us even if we're soft.
Very true, yeah.
But you want to mobilise your base. Jokey things like this really work. And then, of course, eventually we go on for a whole day of this, and then they go to us, and then what do you think is going to happen? And then I go, well, you get elected. And I said, well, we're going to start the transition for socialism. 30 years, we'll arrive at full communism. And they looked at me and they didn't know whether or not I was serious. But then I said to them, if you don't think that, why are you doing it? What's the purpose of being in power if you don't think you're going to build full communism?
This is a really good point. And I think that prior point that you make is a really interesting one. These little sort of micro communities that have popped up on Facebook or Instagram, Twitter, whatever the fuck, that have these kind of comical names that seem so dismissible at first glance. But when you actually look at the communities kind of gravitating around them, they're cycling Mao quotes over the pictures of Incredible Hulk beating up something, and you're like, this seems absurd. And then you realise kind of actually exposing demographics that wouldn't necessarily be exposed to socialist theory. You know what I mean?
I managed to quote Teen Vogue in the last thing I was saying.
Oh, Teen Vogue's really kicked off, isn't it? It's been quite radicalised recently.
No, someone shared it on Facebook about a couple of years ago, and it's Teen article on Marx, and I was supposed to I'm just writing about Marx has gone through cycles, there's sort of bits where he falls out of fashion, the Fabians and Burns, and then it comes back into fashion with Luxembourg and then it falls out of fashion in the 50s with Daniel Bell and Tony Crossland, and then it goes back into fashion with May 68, and then out of fashion with the postmodernists and Blairite, and now Euro-communists. Well, I'm not talking about the Euro-communists. I'm going to talk about them later. John the Baptist, Stuart. Why I hate Stuart Hall. But I think that's partly, they're adapted to our culture, and people miss it. But actually, that's again how you do it. It's exactly like having a cycling club in the early 19th century, the 20th century. They do actually. It's much more like late 19th, early 20th century socialism than the more po-faced people are, because it was seen as a social activity as well. In fact, they had a ska band at your defeat party.
Oh God, yeah.
What's interesting, why didn't they actually at last party conference in Brighton, they had this fucking brilliant garage DJ. I will say.
See, I mean, I've been on side with that.
They were the last. They had this really crap rapper at the Momentum thing. It was really dreadful. Kept saying "fuck Boris" or something like that. And then suddenly the garage DJs came on. By that time, everybody was drunk, or the pills, powder had hit. And that was like the best thing. I thought, this is fucking brilliant. I thought this is what the Labour Party should be like. And then,
yeah, the thing is about this whole the Labour Party. First of all, I wasn't planning on attending. I got dragged on off the end of a Tinder date, which is an incredibly modern political experience. I go into a church room and I'm told, okay, the headlining act's a ska band. The whole thing felt like I went back 40 years back in time to like the early 80s or
that's all right. That's my generation.
Isn't that some sort of subconscious political commentary where it's like, my God, the modern Labour movement has completely failed, so let's follow the cycle right back round again. The 80s.
They were elected as the good art. They stuck it out long enough. And same with Bernie. The Bernie's exactly. He was a guy in the 60s who read, Debs instead of Abiy Hoffman or Mao Zedong. Actually, most of his generation read Mao and then became New Communist Movement or Weather People or something stupid like that. He read Debs and went off and became mayor of Burlington. I'm going to go. It's like...
Thank you so much, Richard. I really appreciate your time.
Become my Facebook friend and Twitter. And
I certainly will.
Join the Class War Games Facebook group. Okay, night. Bye-bye.
Yeah, good night, Richard.
No, Richard.
Bye.
That was fucking good, eh?
Yeah, that was good.
That was fantastic. I'm sorry if I distracted it between,
Oh, no, that's fine. I only had one question. I think it'd been answered, so... Thank you for listening. This has been the Exploding Appendix podcast. If you like this podcast and you'd like to check out more of our work, please visit www.explodingappendix.com. Exploding Appendix. Ideas and culture with guts.